Contents cover inserts title page prologue chapter 1 chapter 2 information prologue what sort of residence would befit Momon, the adamantite-ranked adventurer, an adventurer of the highest rank, a hero possessed of both strength and renown? An elegant mansion towering over vast gardens. A luxury home furnished with only the finest of fittings. A graceful small castle combining both sturdiness and aesthetics in its construction. It would be natural to imagine such lavish accommodations, with servants, maids, or staff in attendance. Anyone would agree that such a residence would be commensurate with the abilities of an adamantite-ranked adventurer, capable of supporting a lifestyle befitting their glory. Indeed, it would be stranger to consider any alternative. Yet where did Ainz actually live? In a modest cozy house, one just slightly but only ever so slightly more expensive than that of the common man. It was a home suitable for a family without children. It is unbefitting of someone of your stature, sir. While not in a shady part of town, one can hardly call it a prime location either. There are far better mansions available. The guide had gently suggested he reconsider several times with such phrases, but Ainz ultimately chose to rent this residence for 2 reasons. It was about a week after the demon Jaldabaoth had rampaged through the royal capital that the then city mayor Panasolii introduced this property to him. The identity of his guide was the first reason. The deposit, key money, broker's fee, security deposit, rent, though they weren't actually called such, would be completely waived regardless of which house in the city he chose to rent, revealing Panasolii's intentions. He wished to make Momon indebted to him by offering a favor, and to make it a substantial favor by offering such a well-located mansion, while also hoping to keep him in the city long-term by providing satisfactory accommodations. As Ainz, he could easily ignore such a favor and do as he wished. However, for the hero Momon, the reputation of being one who returns a favor with ingratitude was to be avoided. He couldn't afford to damage the reputation he had so carefully cultivated up to that point. Thus, his current living situation was the result of trying to keep any favors he received small. Of course, there was also the option of not accepting any favors, declining to rent a house. However, even Ainz could predict that if he did so, they would try to create obligations in other ways that were far more subtle and difficult to refuse, with the magnitude of the debt only becoming apparent in hindsight. A straightforward, material favor like the current arrangement was much easier to handle. When it came to intangible debts such as those involving honor, it was unclear what would constitute repaying a favor with ingratitude, and dealing with that would require Ainz to cram various kinds of knowledge like the unwritten rules of the kingdom's noble society into his head. The other reason was his commoner's intuition that too large a house would be uncomfortable and the utility costs for a mansion would be ridiculous. Though he had grown accustomed to his private room in Nazarick, which was far more luxurious than any building in the kingdom, it seemed the core of Suzuki Satori remained unchanged. Indeed, the first mansion he was shown had a magnificent garden with a profusion of flowers in full bloom, perhaps thanks to magical means, but the commoner-minded Ainz's first thought wasn't how beautiful but rather the pragmatic concern of how troublesome it would be to sweep up fallen leaves and pull weeds. To begin with, thinking that a large residence meant troublesome cleaning was quintessentially a peasant mentality. This was because such mansions employed people to handle the cleaning. Were he to choose that mansion, they could simply hire several gardeners, and if he asked Panasolii for whom, it would be nothing. He would handle everything from introducing reliable gardeners to paying their wages. Every property he was shown had a seemingly excessive number of rooms or separate buildings, leaving him wondering what all those rooms could be used for. The answer was, of course, for the servants. It took a vast number of people to manage an estate and attend to its master. Even cleaning alone required over a dozen personnel. For them, it would be unthinkable to trouble the master with such tasks. At most, some lords might personally tend to their treasure rooms and collections, but even these were most often entrusted to reliable servants. In fact, Ainz's room in Nazarick was cleaned by the regular maids, and Ainz never did a lick of cleaning himself. That he didn't immediately realize this, despite it being something obvious when given some thought, was probably because this was from before the birth of the persona known as the Sorcerer King, when the remnants of Suzuki Satoru, representative of the common man though he had been barely middle class in his world, were still strong. Now that he had grown somewhat accustomed to being waited upon, he might have realized it sooner. Of course, this was just conjecture, and there was a good chance he wouldn't have noticed anything different. After all that back and forth, he ended up renting this place, and for Ainz, who didn't want to accept outsiders into his living space, this small house that he and Narberl could handle completely by themselves wasn't a poor choice. However, he could have gone with something a bit larger. This was because he only later realized his mistake in responding "that's fine" while renting the place when told the bedroom is so small it can only fit one bed. He had replied that way partly out of spite, thinking "I'm sure you wanted to sell me a big favor, what a shame," as one would expect. Being dragged around to be shown mansions that failed to spark even a sliver of interest had naturally led to mental fatigue and a poor attitude, and partly because he thought that since he didn't sleep anyway, he could give the bedroom to Narberl while he read a book in another room or enjoyed some precious alone time. However, he felt something was off about the guide's expression at the time of "Oh, I see, so that's how it is." And when he thought about it a bit later, he understood why they had made such an expression and recognized he had made a major mistake. Certainly, in the eyes of an objective third party, this wouldn't be considered a major blunder. The common perception was that it wouldn't be strange for Ainz and Narberl, properly speaking, Mammon and Nabe, to have that kind of relationship. Mammon, Ainz, had been taken to certain establishments before by those who wanted to tie him to this city. Offering women was a natural approach, but if it became known he had such a relationship with Nabe, it would serve as a strong deterrent against such seductive schemes. Anyone trying to attach a woman to Mammon would think they needed someone superior to, or at least approaching, Nabe in appeal. However, Nabe was extolled as a woman of unparalleled beauty after all. Not only would those making the attempt hesitate, but any woman ordered to seduce Mammon by pushing Nabe aside would find it difficult. Even if the woman was confident in her looks and could rival Nabe in beauty, Nabe was an adamantite-ranked adventurer. In other words, she was one who stood at the pinnacle of violence. It was impossible to steal a man from that kind of woman without feeling dread. Still, for Ainz, who felt like he had been entrusted with his friend's daughter, having such speculations made about them was quite an unpleasant feeling. It was a failure. Whenever they stayed at an inn, they always shared the same room, so some might be tempted to ask why worry about it now. However, he had always made sure to choose a room with 2 beds. 1 room, 2 beds. That should be acceptable. Everyone would surely smile and nod. Even if he told the guide that it wasn't that kind of relationship, they would certainly just smile along while keeping their real thoughts of "what are you talking about, there's no point in trying to deny it to themselves." He couldn't think of any words that would change their conviction. Honestly, he had even considered using control amnesia, but Narberl had convinced him not to. So what was Ainz doing now in the house he had rented under such circumstances? As usual, he was clad in full plate armor, more precisely, fluted armor created by magic. Common sense would dictate that someone who was fully equipped in their own home, in the living room no less, was rather insane. Of course, it would be another matter if they were about to set off on a journey, but there was no such luggage placed on the table before Ainz. As for the armor, if it were chainmail or some other light armor, there might be some eccentrics who could accept it if they took 2, no, maybe 3 steps back. However, the armor Mammon wore was full plate heavy armor. However, this was not because Ainz had gone mad. Naturally, there was a proper reason for it. Mammon san. Thinking that still hasn't changed, I see, Ainz nodded for Narberl to continue speaking. Regarding Albedo-sama's visit to the Adventurers Guild today, what sort of matter is it? Today, instead of leaving it to Pandora's actor, Ainz himself was playing the role of the hero Mammon to meet with Albedo at the Adventurers Guild. Since he had gone straight into preparations after only telling her that much, she had probably been waiting until he was done for a chance to ask questions. It was a natural question from Narberl, who hadn't been told anything. There was no reason why Narberl needed to be kept in the dark. Even before that, he hadn't intended to keep it secret. He had simply thought, "I'll answer if asked," with that level of casualness. Rather, Narbaral's attitude of not taking HREN-S1 lightly made him feel a bit self-conscious. Following the steps to report, inform, and consult was very important. Or in other words, he shouldn't have waited until the day of to tell her. With feelings of guilt in his heart, Ainz, having finished his preparations for the character of Mammon, answered. Albedo will be making a request to Mammon to investigate the Katze plains. A request? Then, Mammon SA in this place, I will allow you to call me Ainz. I too shall call you Narbaral rather than Nabe. Thank you very much. Then, Ainz-sama, has your undercover identity as Mammon not become a subordinate of the Great Sorcerer Kingdom? The question was probably why Albedo, as Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom, would be making a request rather than giving an order to a subordinate. Ainz concurred. 1HREN-S is a mnemonic acronym in Japanese business culture, used to promote smooth communication. It abbreviates report, inform, and consult, and is memorable as a homonym of Ainz, meaning spinach. That is indeed how it's supposed to be. It had been arranged that Mammon would bend the knee so that the Sorcerer Kingdom could rule Irantal peacefully. However, if Mammon were to respond to Albedo's words with yes, I understand. Please command me as you wish, it could cause the assessment and reputation of Mammon as an adamantite-ranked adventurer to drop. Narbaral looked genuinely puzzled as to how obeying the Sorcerer Kingdom's orders could be a factor in lowering one's reputation. Sometimes, too much loyalty can be a problem. Smiling wryly under his helmet, Ainz explained. Not a dog wagging his tail, but a hero who reluctantly bowed his head. That is how I want the people of this city to continue characterizing Mammon's existence. That's why such a troublesome charade is still necessary. That means we cannot yet lower his evaluation. That would be impossible. The character of Mammon still has value. No. Mammon will likely become even more important in the future. The same goes for you too, Nabe. He did not address her as Narbaral, but rather by the name of her character in the kingdom. Yes. Mammon has only one companion. Suddenly, Hamsuk's face flashed through his mind. Only one, The character of Nabe may also become increasingly important in the future. Therefore, we must avoid any action that could give Nabe a bad reputation, to the best of our ability. Do you understand? Narbaral. After hearing Narbaral's respectful acknowledgement, Ainz continued. Please take care even when Pandora's actor is playing the role in my stead. I believe Pandora's actor fully understands the importance of the character Mammon and won't make such mistakes, but a third-party observer might notice something. I understand. Then after your meeting with Albedo-sama, will Pandora's actor Sama resume playing Mammon as usual? For today, or more precisely, until the investigation of the Katze plains is complete, I plan to continue playing Mammon myself. Narbaral slightly knitted her brows. Even though Ainz-sama is better known than before, is it not dangerous to play Mammon while venturing into unknown territory? Will there be guards besides myself to protect you? No, there won't be. If there are powerful beings around Mammon, those with the presence of Nazarick, it might prevent us from catching those we might otherwise lure in. Those we might lure in. After thinking briefly, Narbaral posed a question. People from the theocracy? No. Well, I can't say no for sure either. For now, you know about the rumor that there is a ship that sails across dry land in the Katze plains, right? Yes. I have heard of it. However, it is only a rumor, and the account of the one who supposedly witnessed this ship is unreliable, or something like that. That was it exactly. When Ainz had investigated out of interest, he found the rumor amounted to nothing more than someone claiming to have seen a ship-like shadow moving through the thick fog of the Katze plains, with no detailed information about what kind of ship it was. Since the Katze plains were an area where undead frequently appear, it was called the ghost ship of the fog. Multiple sightings would increase a rumor's credibility, but there was only one sighting report. Furthermore, the sole witness had already retired from being an adventurer, so it wasn't possible to question him directly. Because he was a trustworthy adventurer both as a person and in terms of ability, apparently having been a mithril rank adventurer at the time the information was regarded as unverified rather than fabricated, which wouldn't have been the case if it had come from an adventurer of lower repute. This was because follow-up investigations of the area failed to discover any such ghost ship. That is correct. It is a highly unverifiable story. Generally speaking, the idea of a ship traversing such plains is too far-fetched. However, Ainz said, that is precisely why I can believe it. Ainz explained his theory to Narbarrel, who had a puzzled look on her face. Thinking logically, if someone had intended to deceive others, they could have come up with any number of better lies than this fanciful story. And yet, they still claimed it was a ship? A kind of ship that advances over land, a land ship, perhaps? Unless there was a precedent of such ships being used in neighboring countries, but such a thing hasn't been confirmed even going back through historical records. Why would anyone tell a lie that everyone would doubt? What benefit would there be in that? It was also possible they simply wanted to tell an outrageous lie. There were storytellers who relied on the power of alcohol everywhere, and he had seen people who couldn't distinguish between a little mischief and a prank gone too far. But this adventurer had deliberately reported the sighting to the Adventurers Guild. Would a mithril-ranked adventurer do something as destructive as falsifying such a serious report? So then, Ainz believes the rumor to be true. That's right. Of course, he may have just misidentified something else. Brock too? What was it again? Well, whatever. Regardless of whether it was an actual ship, he probably spoke about something he genuinely saw, or at least, genuinely believed he saw. And if we assume it actually exists, while I considered the possibility of a magical item, I have a strong suspicion that it is a golem. Unless it's a combination of a magical item and undead, a variant of a ghost ship, where a flying ship magical item crashed and its crew, now undead, continue to operate it. A flying ship, is it? Does that mean exactly as the words suggest, a ship that flies through the sky? Narbarrel asked with wide eyes, apparently finding it too far-fetched. This was a natural response, given that he had reached such a conclusion based solely on one eyewitness account. Normally, one would assume that the adventurer mistook something else for a ship in the fog. It was also entirely possible that the adventurer had some set of circumstances that compelled him to concoct this fairy tale. Ainz's belief in the story and speculation about what it might be was the unusual approach. However, Ainz had his reasons for suspecting the adventurer's story might be true. Indeed. While I don't know of it either, and haven't heard even rumors of such things, it wouldn't be strange for such a thing to exist in this world. He had never seen or heard of such things during his time in Yggdrasil. But he wouldn't be surprised if something like that could be made in this world. While Yggdrasil had a high degree of freedom, it was still impossible to do anything beyond what was allowed by the game system. However, this world was developing new magic that wasn't possible in the game. Therefore, it wouldn't too. Ainz is trying to recall the phenomenon Brocken Spectre, where the enormously magnified shadow of an observer is cast mid-air upon a cloud opposite a strong light source like the sun. Be strange if the inhabitants of this world had independently developed things that didn't exist in Yggdrasil. For example, the spell called Floating Board that had transported Ainz and Nabe to the royal capital. Couldn't similar magic be applied to make massive structures float? One might wonder if there were things Ainz could conceive of which the inhabitants of this world could not. Despite his lacking education, Ainz still possessed knowledge of common sense, civilization, and technological products from beyond this world. This knowledge composed the foundation that allowed him to be skeptical and consider various possibilities. Though one wrong step was all it took for his theories to be called the delusions of a madman. Ainz recalled what he had thought when he heard about the ship. Assuming what was observed was either a golem or magical item, the biggest advantage of taking the form of a ship would be cargo capacity. Additionally, the ability to utilize existing shipbuilding expertise for manufacturing, deployment, operation, and management would massively reduce costs. Still, the fact that such a functional design had not yet been implemented meant either the world had yet to reach that concept, there were technological hurdles preventing its creation, or it was being manufactured but kept hidden as a military secret. If a distant country built it and it crashed in the Katze plains during its maiden voyage, and then the project was frozen in the aftermath, that wouldn't contradict any of the facts, and besides, this is a world where monsters roam the sky. Making something large like a ship might be dangerous since it would stand out from far away. It was also possible that training people to control monsters like wyverns, hippogriffs, and griffins might be more cost-effective. However, these were all just Ainz speculations and couldn't serve as evidence for the ghost ship's existence. Yet it would also be premature to dismiss the sighting report as a lie or misidentification and declare investigation unnecessary. The Katze Plains had become territory of the Sorcerer Kingdom. Whether it was a ship or not, whether it existed or not, they needed to eliminate the possibility of something unidentified wandering around in their backyard. Initially, he had considered going with Cocytus and Demiurge. However, that proved difficult. He just couldn't find time in Demiurge's schedule. No, if Ainz said something, Demiurge would make time, but that would weigh on his conscience. It would be like a company president telling a busy subordinate, "Drop what you're doing and come help me move house." Or perhaps it was more like, "Drop what you're doing and come hang out with me." As expected of Ainz-sama. To have considered things so far ahead, doing so must mean there is some reason to conclude that it is a golem. Ainz raised a bony finger while explaining his theory. Yes, to begin with, let us consider 4 possible identities: a land ship that doesn't rely on magical power, a flying ship magical item, a normal ship that became undead, and a ship-shaped golem. Ainz continued while folding his raised fingers one by one. First, the land ship. As I mentioned earlier, there are no records of such things ever having existed throughout history. The same goes for flying ships. While I'm not sure if normal ships as inanimate objects can become undead, but either way it's hard to imagine there being a normal ship this far inland. There are no nearby rivers or lakes, and no indication that this region was once an ocean. Ainz crooked his little finger last and concluded, brimming with confidence, then it must be a golem. This way it wouldn't be randomly attacked by the undead, and since it can move autonomously, we can't entirely rule out that it didn't drift in from somewhere else. This was a process of elimination based on the extremely weak evidence of "we can't rule it out." But even so, Narbarrel showed no doubt and whispered in admiration, as expected of Ainz-sama. The undead hate the living and attack them. For example, assuming the magical item flying ship really existed, it would require a crew to operate. Any living beings aboard would be inevitably sensed by the undead and attacked. On the other hand, an artificially animated construct like a golem would not be actively targeted by unintelligent undead. And if it is a golem, that means there might be a power capable of creating large-scale golems either in this region or nearby. This is how the character of Momonga comes into play. If that power is hostile to or feels threatened by the Sorcerer Kingdom, they might try to make friendly contact with Momonga, who presumably pledged an unwilling allegiance. If they want to take a stance aligned with the Sorcerer Kingdom, they will likewise engage in peaceful dialogue with Momonga, who has come under the Sorcerer Kingdom's control. In this way, it would be safer to advance matters with Momonga rather than with Ooal with the Sorcerer Kingdom. If there was a power that possessed unknown technology in the vicinity, caution was necessary. I don't think there is any such a power nearby, perhaps so. I may be worrying too much. However, as an impossibly remote possibility, Ainz was also considering the prospect that this was something left behind by a player. Yggdrasil allowed for a wide variety of play styles. While most were adventurers like Ainz and his friends, others devoted themselves entirely to agriculture, and some earned in-game currency by accompanying other players and recording their battles. There was also constant demand for creating joke equipment with gimmicks that produced strange effects, and items with incorporated audio and visual effects like the famous Zubabaon Sword 3 and its derivatives were beloved by some people. Among the joke equipment videos Ainz had watched, there was one where a player doing the Man of the Sea pose 4 would cross his arms and give an intense glare with a key sound effect, triggering visual effects of a ship flying a big catch flag over rough water. No, even he had to admit that was a bit much. Even Ainz thought this was purely in the realm of fantasy. However, if by some chance this wasn't just his imagination, it would mean the shadow of a player had fallen over this land. Though it was a bit embarrassing that what led him to investigate this matter, even using himself as bait, was prompted by a joke video that TouchMe had shown him saying, "Take a look at this." It might be the case that a power so distant we haven't gathered information on them has chosen this region to test operate a new type of golem. If they can use teleportation magic like Gate, then it's entirely feasible. If Ainz had to confirm all of Gargantua's combat capabilities without Nazarick, he too would choose to carry out his tests somewhere far away to minimize impact. Whatever I can do, my opponent can too. This notion was likely a reference to Zubaban, a swordsman character from the manga Zubaban and Violence Jack. The mangaka Go Nagai is famous for his other works, including Devilman and Mazinger Z4. The Man of the Sea pose consists of propping a leg up on a belaying cleat, resting an arm on your propped leg, and leaning forward while gazing out over the sea. One of the major pillars of Ainz's behavioral principles. Certainly, it is as you say. If it is a golem, I wish to capture it if possible. I want to use it to diversify our fighting force. So, if we encounter it, refrain from attacking immediately. Understood. If it is a golem, what should we do if we discover someone giving orders nearby, or if it's a magical item with a crew inside? That I won't be able to judge until the time comes. Though he had a strong desire to take it even if he had to kill for it, making enemies of an organization whose details were unknown about which Ainz and his faction had no information would be the height of foolishness. However, in such cases, we would strongly assert that the Katze plains are under the control of the Sorcerer Kingdom, seize them, and then negotiate with their organization. After that, we will return them. Return them. It can't be helped. With insufficient data, we can't risk making enemies, even if they're small. We can take a strong stance since they are operating in another country in the Sorcerer Kingdom's territory as if they own the place, but even so, we will have no choice but to back down without any information on the other party. Well, we can drag out the negotiations and investigate them in the meantime. I can leave that part to Albedo. Ainz couldn't handle such negotiations. So it was better to leave it to someone who could. Understood. Then is it right to say we need to handle this in a way that doesn't cause major damage? That's just as Ainz was about to agree, the sound of someone repeatedly and forcefully banging the front door knocker echoed through the house. Narbarrel frowned in displeasure at the loud, relentless knocking. This was the first time anyone had knocked so noisily on the door to the residence of the adamantite-tranked adventurers Momonga and Nabe. Calm down, Nabe. I know exactly how they feel. After Narbarrel lightly bowed to show her understanding, Ainz instructed her to guide the visitor to the living room where he currently was. As Ainz had expected, the person Narbarrel brought back with her was a receptionist from the Adventurers Guild. She didn't show any sign of surprise when she saw Ainz fully equipped in his living room. No, she probably had no room for such thoughts. Ha, ha, her ragged breathing continued, unable to form words. Her face was bright red, and her forehead was drenched in sweat. She must have run here at full speed, a speed beyond her limits. Though he offered her a chair and encouraged her to calm her breathing, she showed no signs of recovering. Considering the distance from the guild to this point, Ainz realized that it was only natural for an ordinary woman to end up like this. Honestly, why didn't she ask some adventurer who was probably nearby to run for her instead? Nabe. Please bring some water. The receptionist weakly raised a hand in protest, but Narbarrel ignored her entirely and left the room. Rather than agreeing with the receptionist, Narbarrel's attitude suggested that Ainz's orders were overwhelmingly more important than the receptionist's wishes. After drinking the water Narbarrel brought, the receptionist finally regained enough composure to explain her purpose. "Ah, the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom Albedo-sama ordered me to summon Momon-sama. I beg of you, will you please come with me?" So that's why she couldn't ask an adventurer, Ainz realized, and then wondered, why would Albedo order a receptionist to do this? However, he couldn't find an answer. There was no way Ainz could figure out how much thought a clever person like Albedo put into her words. It seemed that Ainz's silent contemplation had been taken the wrong way. The receptionist looked physically unwell. Was this because she had run here at full speed? Or was this because of her fear of Albedo? Was she thinking about what might happen to her if Momon didn't come? Ainz answered the receptionist's pleading tone as planned, "Let's go right away." Since he had already made his preparations, they could leave immediately. After parting ways with the visibly relieved receptionist in front of the house, Ainz and Nabe headed toward the guild. At first, they had intended to go together with the receptionist, but she had become unable to stand due to extreme fatigue and needed some time to recover. Thus, following the receptionist's natural suggestion that it would be too presumptuous, too frightening to keep the Sorcerer Kingdom's Prime Minister Albedo-sama waiting, the two of them ended up going by themselves. Ainz muttered to himself repeatedly. Before long, the guild came into view. 4 Death Knights stood in front of the guild. He had thought there might be a crowd of curious onlookers forming a human fence, but the street facing the guild was deserted, with not a soul in sight. This must be a testament to how much Albedo in this case, how much the Sorcerer Kingdom was feared. If this started happening after I walked around with angels in tow, that would mean it was a big mistake. Perhaps the fact that I'm undead makes it even more frightening? Passing between the Death Knights, Ainz and Nabe opened the door to the guild. The first thing that caught his eye upon entering was Albedo. She stood in front of the guild's counter in her usual attire, and by the wall were the 2 Death Knights serving as her escort. Of course, there were probably other things lurking there that were her actual guards. But Ainz, who hadn't pursued any rogue-type classes, couldn't tell for certain. On the other side of the counter, the receptionist, naturally a different person from the one who had come to summon Ainz, who seemed to be attending to Albedo, slightly relaxed her stiff expression upon seeing Ainz enter. Standing next to her, Guildmaster Pluton Inzach wore the same expression. It was nostalgic. This must have been the first time since he visited the Empire that he'd seen him. No, Pandora's actor disguised as Momon had probably met with him in the interim. "You're late." Ainz exaggeratedly shrugged his shoulders at Albedo's threatening voice. "I came as quickly as I could. If you didn't want to be kept waiting, you should have made an appointment in advance." Ainz could see the faces of the receptionist and Inzach visibly stiffen. "Ara, such an attitude. Is this arrogance towards your client due to the privileged position of being an adamantite-ranked adventurer?" "Client?" Apparently, the Sorcerer Kingdom's Prime Minister Kaka isn't aware. For non-urgent requests, the guild usually sends an investigation team first. Only after they determine what rank of job it is do adventurers act. In other words, even if you bring a request, it hasn't been decided that I will accept it. This is a designated request. Again. You don't seem pleased. But you have no right to refuse. The adventurer guilds within this city, within the Empire, all will be placed under the control of the Sorcerer Kingdom, in time. Know that the words of the state of Insama take precedence over everything else. No. I can understand if it's an order from the state, but I don't think my opinions need to be given such priority. Almost letting his true self show, Ainz firmly held back. There was no room in his head for unnecessary thoughts. If he allowed them in, the lines he'd worked so hard to memorize would slip right out and disappear. "I shall relay to you His Majesty the Sorcerer King's words. Go to the Katze plains and solve the mystery of the ship said to exist within the fog. I permit you to be moved to tears of gratitude at receiving this royal command. But I refuse." Ainz's quick response made Inzach and the receptionist turn pale. Ara, Albedo smiled sweetly. It was a beautiful smile that even Ainz found somewhat frightening. I said earlier that you have no right to refuse, didn't I? His Majesty the Sorcerer King found value in you, but did that make you conceited? Or did you just get carried away? Which is it, I wonder? Won't you tell me? I certainly bent my knee to the Sorcerer King. However, I won't stand for being treated like a convenient tool. And while you first said it was a designated request, you just called it a royal command, didn't you? Well, let me hear it. Which is it? Of course, judging from the context, it can be interpreted that the Sorcerer King has issued an order, and you are trying to pass it off as a request. But, is that so? Really? You wouldn't be trying to blur the lines between designated request and royal command, would you? You wouldn't be attempting some petty trick to establish a precedent, one where I act on the Sorcerer King's orders, would you? 2 sharp intakes of breath could be heard from the receptionist and Ainz. If you want me to act, make a proper request through the Adventurers Guild. Don't try to get me to accept informally, make a proper contract. Ainz and Albedo stared silently at each other. So Momonga will take such an attitude even when told the guild will be placed under the Sorcerer Kingdom's control. Hey! I don't need that kind of ad-lib. Ainz felt put on the spot, but took care not to show it. I understand. Without waiting for Ainz to reply, Albedo gave a mysterious nod. What should I do? Ainz watched for Albedo's next move, but her demeanor indicated she had thrown the conversational ball to his side of the court. The faint sound of fabric rubbing against skin as she moved slightly. A silence so profound was created that even such minimal sounds could be clearly heard. And it was Ainz who broke it. Of course, Ainz didn't want to be the one to break it, but he had no other choice. If you make a formal request and offer suitable compensation, then there's no doubt that I will accept. However, I must have you promise not to harm the people of this city while I'm away. The latter is not a problem. If the person has committed no crime, they will not be needlessly harmed. They are His Majesty the Sorcerer King's precious property, after all. Then I'll have you deposit the standard payment with the guild. With that, I will specially accept this in the form of a designated request. Receptionist. I'm not confident I can provide the appropriate sum at this moment. Will this suffice? One of the Death Knights stepped forward and placed a leather bag on the counter with a thud. The sound of coins clinking together could be heard. I'll make preparations. I am sure the Prime Minister of the Sorcerer Kingdom wouldn't appear here with anything less than the prescribed amount. Guildmaster, please gather as much information as possible pertaining to the Katze Plains as quickly as you can. Indeed. Let this matter be carried out promptly. It's not good to keep His Majesty waiting for even 1 second, worker. That is. Ainz started to shout, but Ainz raised his hand to stop him from saying anything more. I swear it on my name, I shall handle this matter. Ainz turned around and started walking. Needless to say, this piece of theatre had been staged by Albedo. The flow of events from beginning to end had all been decided in advance. Though Albedo had more ad-libs than expected, Ainz had memorized the lines he was given word for word. The existence known as Momonga must not be seen as a dog of the Sorcerer Kingdom. The Sorcerer King must not be thought of as his master and owner. That was why it was necessary to put on this little act. While the tempo may have been a bit slow since Ainz was desperately trying to remember the proper sequence of events as he spoke, no one seemed to have noticed that anything was off. For that reason he didn't understand why Ainz had almost shouted, there was no need for any weird ad-libs. The next time we do something like this, I should prepare some notes that I can properly review. Well, I'll need to find a time to actually read them, though. Chapter 1. A barren land known as the Katze Plains stretched between the kingdom and the empire, southeast from the kingdom's perspective, and southwest from the empire's. While quite vast, it was known to many as an uninhabitable waste, unable to support humans or any other form of life. More than being the battlefield for the annual clashes between the kingdom and empire, it was well known to be an undead hotspot, a cursed land. It was said that the undead were more likely to appear in places where many of the living had died. Therefore, it was not uncommon to witness undead appearing naturally at the sites of former battlefields, wandering about and attempting to kill the living. However, not all battlefields could be described as cursed. There was a special reason why the Katze plains were said to be cursed. It was as if the plains possessed a will of their own, an ill will that seemed to favor the undead. Although there were some undulations, the plains were almost entirely flat, and yet one could not see across them. This was because throughout the year, a thin fog constantly blanketed the entire plains. Moreover, this fog never dissipated. It remained there regardless of weather, temperature, or season. Almost as if to conceal the undead it harbored. This fog would only lift during the annual battles between the kingdom and empire. And during these periods, new appearances of the undead miraculously ceased. Yes, it was as if the land itself wished to welcome the new casualties. No, perhaps that was exactly what was happening. It was only natural that some would despise the idea of fighting in such a place. Just like adding kindling to a flame, like a mother bird feeding its chicks, they were offering corpses to this cursed land. However, disregarding the undead, there was no more suitable place geographically for the two armies to confront each other, and they couldn't ignore the risk that if they were to pile mountains of corpses and shed rivers of blood elsewhere, those places might also end up as cursed lands like the Katze plains. But the problems didn't end there. If the undead were left unchecked, there was a tendency for stronger undead to emerge. As a matter of fact, very few undead wandered out of the fog, and there had been almost no casualties to date. Conversely, this meant that the undead that emerged in this area would continue to accumulate within the fog in the long run, creating a breeding ground for more powerful undead to appear. And powerful undead often possessed high intelligence. Unlike the lower-ranked chaff that instinctively remained in the fog, they might venture outside the Katze plains in an attempt to kill the hated living. The first to be attacked would be one of the several countries that bordered the Katze plains, including the kingdom and empire. Even if both nations directly responsible managed to avoid any damage, it was clear as day that they would face condemnation from the surrounding countries that suffered casualties due to their continued stoking of this flame. Therefore, the kingdom and empire jointly established a city dedicated to the suppression of the undead. Funds from the temples also flowed into this city. This was why adventurers were not permitted to freely use healing magic. Much of the offerings and compensation received when temple priests provided healing magic and other priestly services were channeled there. Simply put, business competitors were unwanted. And so, a city was built near these Katze plains. A city that, while receiving funding from both nations, belonged to neither. And a frontline city for protecting the living and fighting against the undead. It was named the Free City of Vadis. This city wasn't particularly large of scale, and its population was surprisingly small. However, surrounded by sturdy walls with copper plates and other materials built into the interior to guard against undead attacks, the city befitted its role as a strategic base for the undead suppression efforts in the Katze plains, and housed various individuals skilled in fighting the undead. These included the forces of the various temples, adventurers, a century of imperial knights, mercenaries, and others. The entrance to this city, a set of thick but modestly sized doors engraved with the holy symbols of the four great gods, the most widely worshipped deities in both kingdom and empire, the fire god, water god, wind god, and earth god and their subordinate minor gods, opened slightly to reveal the figures of a party of men. Beyond the doors, outside the city, spread the reddish-brown soil of the Katze plains, looking as if fresh blood had been mixed into the soil. Inhaling the fog from the plains made their nostrils quiver with the faint smell of wet earth, mold, and death, the scent of a graveyard. The sky hung low. It was as if the clouds that should have been suspended high above had fallen toward the ground. The boundary between fog and clouds appeared to be non-existent. The group passed through the gate without hesitation into this alien landscape where a white world spread above and a crimson earth dominated below. There were 10 of them in total. For a party heading into the Katze plains, this number was neither particularly small nor large. Moreover, none rode horses or other mounts, or even used them for transport. This was due to the ability of some undead to instill fear in animals, meaning that depending on the kind of undead they faced, horses and other animals might panic and become a liability to handle. It would be no laughing matter to have horses bolt while under attack by the undead, requiring their attention to be divided. Of course, since there were undead with the ability to instill fear in all living beings, both horses and humans alike, it was difficult to judge which was better, but between a horse galloping at full speed in the wrong direction and a not-so-strong human running at full speed, the latter was at least easier to catch. Therefore, if they were unable to command magical beasts, it was common for those who set foot on the Katze plains to hire people to serve as porters. Porters were, as the name suggested, those who carried essential supplies like food and water. While it was possible to create water and food through magic, it was natural to carry such supplies in anticipation of an emergency like the injury or death of a magic caster. Furthermore, having someone who could run communications during a critical situation was invaluable. The party was arranged with 2 people in front, 2 at the rear, and the remaining 6 in the middle. 4 of the 6 in the middle were porters carrying large bags. Of the 2 non-porters in the middle group, one was a worker, while the other was an inspector. An inspector's job was to count the undead defeated in the Katze plains and ensure the proper payment of subjugation bounties. Most inspectors were retired adventurers, former nobility from the empire or kingdom, or those unable to inherit the family title, or priests. The formation, divided into 3 separate clusters, appeared spread so far apart that it might lead one to think they didn't get along, but there was a good reason for this. It was to guard against area of effect spells like fireball or special abilities such as an aura of fear. Of course, if they spread too far apart, they might not be able to provide support in time when under attack. While finding this balance was difficult to the uninitiated, it was second nature to those who earned their living in this land. Indeed, this party's spacing was exemplary. From positioning alone, those with knowledge could immediately identify the strongest members of this company. Naturally, it was the 4 guarding the front and rear the crucial positions to defend. But that wasn't all. There must be someone to buy time if the middle was attacked. So it was safe to assume there were 1 or 2 such individuals stationed in the middle. In fact, 5 people in this party were renowned workers. Workers. This referred to those who had dropped out of or sought greater freedom than being adventurers. Normally, job requests were collected by the Adventurers Guild, investigated, and then assigned to adventurers of the appropriate rank. In other words, the guild investigated in the initial stage whether a job was appropriate. Therefore, all unduly risky job requests such as those involving criminal activity were rejected without fail. For example, the guild would use its power to prevent jobs like the procurement of plants used in the production of narcotics from being accepted. Furthermore, the guild also refused jobs that would destroy the balance of an ecosystem. For instance, they wouldn't proactively kill monsters that occupied the highest trophic level in certain forests. This was to avoid situations where killing such monsters disrupted the balance of power, resulting in other monsters venturing outside the forest. Of course, it would be a different matter if an apex monster left the forest to encroach on human living spaces. In other words, adventurers were like the allies of justice. However, the world could not run on such pretty words alone. There were those who desired wealth above all else. Some sought dangerous jobs for greater rewards. There were even those who simply enjoyed killing monsters. Those who were drawn to the darker aspects of being an adventurer rather than the good. Adventurer dropouts. Such people were both derisively and warily called workers. However, not all workers were such individuals. For example, suppose there was a severely injured boy in a village. Would it be okay for a passing adventurer to use healing magic to cure the boy's wounds for free? The answer would be no. It was forbidden by adventurer rules to perform healing magic for free, that is, without collecting the prescribed payment. Generally, healing magic fell under temple jurisdiction, with spells being cast in exchange for an offering. If adventurers were permitted to perform healing for free, the temples would lose their livelihood. Therefore, the temples had firmly instructed the Adventurers Guild not to allow such practices. If one could not accept such guild rules, there was no choice other than to become a worker. While the temples might seem like corrupt organizations from this description, it was precisely because they could secure this revenue that they were able to distance themselves from politics and work for the sake of the people. Moreover, they used such funding to train priests and strive to save as many people as possible. This also allowed them to bankroll the operating funds that flowed into the free city of Vadis. Thus, every coin had two sides. The same went for workers. Even if motivated by profit, there might be cases where overharvesting medicinal herbs could benefit the people by allowing for cheaper production of medicine. Of course, few aimed to become workers from the start. Since workers didn't enjoy the protections of the guild, they needed to handle everything themselves. Because to this, they might easily die due to lacking vital information, and there were many cases of workers dying within their first year of becoming a worker. But this party was different. They had been working as a team for several years already. While individual strength certainly played a role, this was largely possible due to the presence of the man walking at the front. This was Antwali, the leader of this worker team. And he was strong. Anyone who saw him would have that first impression. He stood at around 2 meters tall, but it wasn't just his height that caught the eye. It was his entire body. Just incredibly thick. His chest, arms, legs and his neck. Though his physique made it easy to believe he had mixed race blood, he was purely human. He was simply born blessed with an exceptionally sturdy frame and superior physical abilities. His wild features visible beneath his helmet, while not hideous, suggested something bestial and inspired wariness in observers. He wore unusual armor with a howling wolf's head protruding from the breastplate, under which chainmail hung like a surcoat or curtain down to his feet. His arms were fitted with a macabre pair of gauntlets that seemed to be fashioned from the hide torn off some beast, undoubtedly magical items. In his right hand he gripped a footman's flail, its striking head being a fearsome metal rod fitted with vicious spikes. "What's going on up ahead?" Antwali stared through the thin fog, calling out to the man beside him. He wasn't asking about what lay a few dozen meters ahead in the fog. He was asking about what awaited them beyond that, over 100 meters ahead where no ordinary person could see through the obscuring fog. No signs of undead. Let's keep going. You don't sense any danger either, do you, Antwali? The man questioned. Bunaz answered. When the two stood side by side, they gave off the impression of the beauty and the beast. Bunaz's refined and slender features appeared almost feminine, although he was definitely a male. His elegant features suggested that noble blood flowed through his veins. He wore grey leather armor interspersed with patches of golden hair, and in one hand he carried a massive bow as tall as he was. Though his quiver contained only 2 arrows, these 2 were abnormally large. They were closer in size to spears rather than arrows, which was the reason behind his epithet long spear. No, I don't sense anything like that. Alrighty. Then that's it, then. By the way, the plan remains unchanged. We head to our original destination, the first broken tower, clean up the surroundings, and then call it a day, right? The broken towers were a series of collapsed towers scattered throughout the vast Katze plains. These ruined towers, 7 confirmed in total, were numbered 1 through 7 in order of proximity to the Free City, and served as landmarks. They had been reinforced by human hands to serve as emergency strongholds, so a basic strategy for exploring the plains was to first secure a safe base by hunting undead around the first broken tower. After that, we use it as a base camp and finish this hunt with a major cleanup of the area. No change of heart. Being the first broken tower the closest to the city, undead extermination was frequently carried out here, so there likely weren't any strong undead nearby. However, that didn't mean they could let their guard down, since undead might wander in from the depths, the unexplored interior of the plains where hunting hadn't reached. This was especially true because, unlike magical beasts, it remained unclear how the undead handled the concept of territory. For the distant Broken Towers numbers 4 through 7, it was standard practice for multiple teams of workers or adventurers to cooperate and form larger parties. Therefore, it would be quite risky to head there with such a small group as they now had. Yes. It won't change no matter how many times you ask. As you know, this time we negotiated until the very last minute but couldn't get any of the other teams to work with us. I'm sure you're disappointed that your earnings will be low, but we'll end our hunt around here. Going in too deep would be dangerous. Bunaz narrowed his eyes. His well-formed features made his expression seem almost frightening. No, perhaps this was an expression befitting the resolve of a top-tier worker. Noticing his expression, Antwali felt reassured. It's dangerous further in? Is that your intuition speaking? Or is it just common knowledge? Don't worry. It's not intuition. As Antwali spoke, Bunaz's expression eased, and his usual handsome looks returned. Something that could be interpreted as either carelessness, composure, or relief seemed to dominate his mind. However, from Antwali's perspective, this wasn't a particularly good expression either. This was, after all, dangerous territory. Still, he understood how Bunaz felt. It was one of the reasons this team had survived for so long. It was Antwali's intuition at work. His bad feelings tend to be quite accurate. Probably stemming from an innate special ability, Antwali had exceptional aptitude for preventing enemy surprise attacks. The fact that he walked in the front rank as a second check alongside the skilled ranger Bunaz, despite having no scouting skills himself, was solely due to this ability. Well, that's good. Before he could finish his words, a loud shout came from behind. Antwali! Undead reaction up ahead. Seems to be low rank. In an instant, tension spread among the group, more accurately, among those in the center. Even though it was low-rank undead, that was relative to workers like them. Though the porters steeled themselves to encounter undead when entering these plains, they were barely more capable than ordinary people. Even if they used magic to ward against fear, it couldn't completely erase the terror welling up from within. Antwali and Bunaz exchanged glances, each with grim expressions. What was their little exchange about? No undead and no danger just now. This was beyond embarrassing. Since it could even cause those who overheard them to doubt their abilities, it made them want to grumble. He should have just quietly told the two of us in secret. But expecting such tactful consideration from the man who had shouted, especially when the undead were involved, was a mistake. The one who had shouted was Candylon Galion. One of the two in the rear rank. He was an expert in slaying the undead, a priest and a warrior who held the job of undead buster. His sturdy physique, rivaling Antwali's, was covered head to toe in full plate armor, complete with a full face helmet, and in his hand was a large mace. The heavy head of the mace bore his god's holy symbol. This was what he used to crush the skulls of the undead. That was the kind of priest he was. Normally, undead detection wouldn't work on these plains. This was because the fog that blanketed the plains gave off undead reactions, so activating such abilities would detect undead reactions coming from all directions simultaneously. However, those who took up the job of undead buster continued to serve their god even while fighting the undead. The zeal with which they exterminated the undead took the form of magic, piercing through even the fog of this cursed land. Thus, Candelon's detection spells were enhanced to be able to detect undead reactions even within this fog. We can't see them. Bunaz? What do you think? Like I said, there's no sign of undead up ahead. His face shifted, turning toward the sky. Same goes for above. I don't sense any movement. Incorporeal undead became difficult to spot when not moving, but that didn't mean it was impossible to do so. With Bunaz's perceptive abilities, he should be able to detect something if it was there. In that case, it seemed more likely this was something completely outside his field of vision. Then, either invisible undead, or they're hiding underground. That's possible. Or maybe undead more skilled at stealth than I am. They're not entirely non-existent, you know. In that case, everyone, come here. As he called out to those behind, the team members gathered around. Really now? He knew we'd call them over. He could have just given us the warning in a quieter voice after he got here. Damn it, Antwali, you know it can't be helped. That's just the way Candelon is. While Bunaz thought the loud warning from behind was intended to alert everyone about the imminent encounter and prepare the non-workers for battle, Antwali believed otherwise. He was certain that Candelon was so excited about the prospect of fighting the undead, everything else had completely slipped his mind. A man wearing full plate armor like Candelon silently walked up to them. He carried a large shield called a tower shield and a mace. On his back was strapped a spear, which gave the impression that it had seen better days. If Antwali was this team's sword, then Hedit's Elderwood was their shield. He was an excellent warrior with strong defensive capabilities thanks to his sturdy equipment, and he could also use blessing spells. Unlike paladins who served a holy faith and its righteous law, he was a crusader who advanced toward his own holy cause, his own righteous purpose. Because he tended to prioritize his own justice over the law, he occasionally attracted trouble. However, since he was fundamentally a good person, one couldn't help but acknowledge that his actions were reasonable, which was troublesome in its own right. If not for this, or if he was inferior in terms of ability, they would have chosen to cut him off for the sake of the team. Ha, no, it's too tiring to walk this far without stoppin'. All uncle who's lost his stamina can do to keep up with you younger folk. The last to appear, muttering complaints as always, was Envario. The oldest member of this worker team, he was in his mid-40s. He had scruffy stubble and dull skin. He hid his thinning hair under a hood, but he would look even more pathetic without it, and many might look down on him. However, his equipment was magnificent. An immaculate set of yellow robes, a staff with 4 faintly glowing yellow gems set in its tip. Every piece of equipment radiated magical power that even an ordinary person could sense. In particular, from the plain silver ring on his finger, mana could be seen rising like ripples in the air. His skill with arcane magic was first-rate, and he was capable of casting even 4th-tier spells. However, as if in exchange, his physical abilities weren't very high. In fact, they were quite low. He was perhaps only on par with a novice adventurer in that regard. Entwali the warrior, known as Howling Wolf. Bunez the ranger cum archer, known as Long Spear. Candelon Galian, the divine caster cum warrior. Dietz Elderwood, the crusader. Envario the arcane caster, known as the worn-out old man. These 5 were the members of the worker team known as Fist. Now then, you probably heard, but Candelon reported an undead reaction. However, Bunaz and I can't see anything. We're thinking they might be invisible or hiding underground. Is there anything else you can think of? Envario. Without knowing how far, but even with all these livin' people here, they haven't attacked us yet, which makes Uncle think they're the ambushin' type. So, Don Cha think they're most likely hidin' underground. Candelon. Your thoughts? After closing his eyes and activating his ability, Candelon spoke. I agree with Envario. To add a bit more, these are undead that the 2 of you can't detect, and they don't seem to be approaching us. If they were incorporeal, it wouldn't be strange for them to come at us directly. So rather than incorporeal undead, it's more likely to be undead that burrow into the ground. Antwali shifted his gaze to Dietz, who silently shook his head. Next, then. Assuming they're an ambush type, do we fight or avoid them? The most frightening scenario was being attacked by other undead while already engaged in combat. In a sense, the non-combatants in their party were a hindrance, so they'd prefer to avoid unnecessary battles. Getting caught in a pincer attack would be a nasty development. Moreover, without having seen them, without knowing the enemy's true nature, the danger level was high. There was a tacit agreement in this land that teams that discovered undead should only engage them within reasonable limits in the sense of preventing the emergence of stronger undead, but there was no need to strictly follow this. The most important thing was the lives of their comrades. He looked back. Though the city they had departed was completely hidden by the thin fog, they hadn't traveled far. In other words, this area was regularly cleared, so the undead probably weren't that strong. Ignoring the man excitedly swinging his mace while chanting "Fight! Fight!" the four of them exchanged glances. "We'll fight. Let's go with the usual routine." There were no objections to the leader's decision. The other four nodded silently. One nodded particularly vigorously and set down their bags. Only the worker team would participate in combat. Since the current matter couldn't be considered an emergency, it was normal for the others accompanying them not to lend a hand. That was in the terms of their contract to begin with. As luck would have it, the one serving as inspector this time was a priest. Incidentally, the worst kind of inspectors were former nobles from the kingdom or empire who showed no sign of anxiety despite setting foot in the dangerous Katze plains. However, he showed no indication of wanting to offer help either. There was a good chance that he wouldn't help even if their team was completely wiped out. That was because his role was to report what had happened back to the city. Rather than risking his own life trying to save 9 people, bringing back information like the appearance of a powerful undead that could kill 9 people, including a worker team, would be more important, something that everyone not counting the dead would understand. Seeing that Antwali's group had begun preparing for battle, their traveling companions set down their packs and arranged them in a circle, taking a formation where they could hide behind their cargo. Though thin, the porters carrying frames contained metal plates, allowing them to be used like tower shields for complete cover. Since aspiring adventurers sometimes took these dangerous jobs to buy equipment, it was quite a practiced, confident stance. Even those young enough to be called boys showed tension but no fear. In a sense, you could say they were prepared. In the center of the formation stood the inspector. He probably intended to use magic if necessary. Holding a holy seal in one hand, he surveyed the surroundings. There was no telling whether other undead might attack while Antwali's group was fighting the enemies in front. Of course, Antwali and his team had no intention putting on such a disgraceful display. Having casualties among their companions would be tantamount to failing the job. The inspector being required to use magic would be seen as making him work beyond the scope of his duties, imposing an extra burden on him. Anyone would naturally give a harsh evaluation to the responsible party if made to do work outside the terms of their contract. If there were any casualties among the porters, it would spread a bad reputation. In a sense, it would be treated as a failure to protect those under their guard. If that happened, they'd find it difficult to hire porters in the future. After all, who would want to be hired if they thought they might be the next victim? And rumors would spread among workers and adventurers alike about the team's inadequacy. That would be a significant disadvantage for finding future work, particularly in this area. Well then, I'll go lure them out. Declaring this, Bunaz ran alone in their direction of travel, in the direction where the undead reaction was reported. His movements were agile and swift, with no sign of hesitation. When he reached a certain point, the earth cracked around Bunaz. And hands emerged. Many, many hands. The bizarre sight of multiple hands protruding from the ground like swaying stalks of seaweed might paralyze those faint of heart. But Bunaz was a veteran worker. Without any magical effects at work, this level of display wouldn't faze him. No doubt using some special ability, 6 undead emerged from the ground around Bunaz with surprising speed. They appeared to be squat masses of earth with thick, stubby limbs sprouting from them. Their eyes and mouths were gaping holes, with red points burning in the depths of their eye sockets. While they might look like golems at first glance, they were unmistakably undead. Grave dead, hi! Anvario exhaled a small sigh of relief as he uttered the name of the undead. An atmosphere of, well, that's nothing, spread among Antwali's group. This was not an attitude one should have when their companion was surrounded by enemies, but it was because they understood the difference in combat ability between them and their foes that it was acceptable. If evaluated by the difficulty rating that adventurers used for monsters, Grave Dead would be around a difficulty rating of 15. The undead that appeared on the outskirts and just inside the Katze plains were mostly low rank. Most ranged between difficulty rating 1 and 30. However, that was no reason to let their guard down. Though they emerged rarely, stronger undead might still appear. And the longer an area went without being cleared, and the deeper ventured into the interior, the stronger the undead that would appear. The misshapen undead moaned and trudged toward Bunaz with sluggish movements befitting their appearance. The grave dead had some resistance to physical attacks and possessed the ability to slowly regenerate so long as their feet were in contact with the ground. They were troublesome opponents for teams that relied on purely physical attacks, and those adventurers who made their living killing skeletons and zombies would have no choice but to flee. But what was most frightening was what happened when they grabbed a hold of you. True to their name, their skill burial allowed them to sink their victims into the ground as if it were water. Of course, they didn't bury you very deeply, so if you could quickly dig up the earth temporarily softened by the undead's ability, you would be saved. However, should a companion be buried and incapacitated, there was no doubt that your team's combat strength would be dramatically reduced. However, for Entwali and his group, these enemies couldn't even be considered a threat. With a series of nimble maneuvers, Bunaz guided the grave dead away from the group. The grave dead, not possessing high intelligence, straightforwardly followed after Bunaz, intent on burying this hateful living being in the ground and killing it. Widen magic fireball. Then a soaring fireball impacted the ground, the expanding flames instantly engulfing the undead. The undead, their false life burned away, collapsed and returned to the earth as ashes. And that was the end of it. While Entwali cautiously surveyed the surroundings to check if any undead were drawn in by the light of the earlier fireball, Dietz poked him in the ribs. At the same time, he sensed footsteps from behind. Looking back, he saw the person he expected to see was approaching. Beyond him, through the thin fog, he could see the 4 porters wearing expressions of respect. They had probably gathered information about Fist's reputation before they were hired, but seeing it firsthand made it real. The sight of them annihilating their enemies with a single fireball must have been particularly impactful. Being able to cast fireball was proof of a highly skilled magic caster. And since team members were generally all about the same strength, it meant that those who didn't participate in the battle must be equally as strong. This was why the porters breathed sighs of relief. They knew that the information they had collected was true, and that their chances of returning home safely were high. Feeling the tension dissipate, Entwali nodded internally. This was the routine. They defeated opponents that they could have otherwise ignored not only to earn a little coin, but more importantly to demonstrate their strength and inspire trust in their team. When fierce battles occurred in the future, having their companions' trust would make a big difference. So when accompanying new companions, Entwali's team always performed this kind of routine. Amazing, though perhaps saying that would be discourteous to veteran workers like yourselves. Anvario responded to the inspector's question as he walked up. No, at my age, I don't get a whole lot of compliments. So, it makes Uncle very happy. That's good. Just to confirm, there were 6 grave dead, is that correct? That's correct. This confirmation check was necessary because some monsters might look similar but be different variants, or even be completely different species, especially among insectoid types, where certain species were distinguishable only by subtle differences. After Entwali answered affirmatively, the inspector posed his next question. Can I assume it's safe here for now? Should be fine, right? What do you think, Candelon? Candelon nodded at Bunaz's words as he rejoined the group. If you all agree, then it must be safe, the inspector said, pulling out a thick sheet of paper, a portable inkwell, and a quill pen from his pocket. He began to write down the name and number of the defeated undead. Do you mind if I also ask you a question? What is it? Entwali questioned the inspector, who replied in turn as he put away his finished writing. Though he would have preferred to ask him this within the Free City, he chose a place without eavesdroppers due to various concerns. What will happen to the Free City from here on out? Ah! The temple higher ups are in turmoil. At present, we've been absorbed into the territory of the Sorcerer Kingdom, where that accursed undead rules as king. By any normal standards, this isn't a good turn of events. So, the natural thing to do would be to withdraw from the Free City. After all, considerable funds flow from the temples to maintain and operate the Free City, which could be seen as indirectly supporting the Sorcerer Kingdom and the undead, couldn't it? Whether we fight here or withdraw, either way we're benefiting the undead, which is infuriating. He answered without hesitation. It was the kind of casual openness that made Antoine wonder if he would have spoken just as freely even within the Free City. However, completely withdrawing could be seen as tacitly allowing the danger posed by ceding control of this cursed land to that undead. Plus, it would become difficult to monitor what it plans to do. Which option do you think is more beneficial for us members of the temples? I dunno about the temples, but for us old folk, carrying on as before would be nice, though I suppose that's impossible. The rumors about the kingdom and empire withdrawing their funding now that the Katze plains have become Sorcerer Kingdom territory are true, right? When Anvario and Bunaz, the two members of this worker team that excelled at gathering information, spoke up, the inspector laughed tiredly. It's true. With both nations withdrawing, it will be very difficult for the city to survive on support from the temples alone. We will have no choice but to cut bounties and such. And skilled workers like yourselves will surely leave the city to seek better paying opportunities elsewhere. The inspector held up a finger and twirled it in a circle. Then cleaning up the undead will become less effective, the rate at which powerful undead appear will increase, and we will be driven into a situation where we are forced to abandon the city, perhaps. A vicious cycle. A tragic future indeed. Well, the prevailing opinion among us is that we should wait to see how the Sorcerer Kingdom intends to handle the Free City and understand their actions before making any decisions. It was a wait-and-see approach. However, rewards would undoubtedly be reduced. If they couldn't provide compensation commensurate with the danger, there was little merit in fighting here. They were workers. Reward was their absolute belief. What a shame. Looks like this will be our last time. As Antoine muttered those words, Candelon said nothing, but his face strongly betrayed his feelings of discontent. While I'm super interested in all this talk, it seems weird to have a long conversation here, and we're almost at the broken tower. Shall we get moving? No one could object to Bunaz's entirely reasonable suggestion. The group reformed their ranks and set off again. It wasn't as though Antoine had no complaints about the situation. There were a certain number of workers who initially became adventurers because they admired the heroes of fairy tales, and Antoine was one of them. Though various circumstances had led him to walk among the shadows, the fact that he was protecting the peace in this city by defeating the undead was a definite source of pride. If he could live by eating fog alone, he might have stayed in the Free City of Vadis and continued his activities. However, there was no helping the fact that Antoine was still only human. He had to earn to live, and he could never become a hero like those in fairy tales. And happily ever after endings, it seemed, only existed in fairy tales. Chapter 2. Through the thin fog, the shadow of a collapsed tower loomed. The tower had crumbled from around halfway up, and judging by the debris scattered widely across the surrounding area, it must have once been quite tall. Stones as tall as a person stood thrust into the earth, seeming almost like forgotten grave markers. The broken tower. Its appearance made the name not just fitting, but inevitable. No other name could possibly be suitable. The enigmatic remains of a monument with no clear nation of origin, built for an undiscernible purpose in isolation from other settlements, with its cause of collapse unknown. This ruined tower was now stocked with ample food supplies and fortified with a sturdy, well-maintained door so people could barricade themselves inside to escape the enemy. Not only that, but reinforcements have been carefully added to prevent any further collapse. The simple wooden fence, or rather, wall surrounding the tower had deliberately spaced gaps barely wide enough for a person to slip through. While it wouldn't stop small undead from entering, this incomplete enclosure was preferable, as it allowed those still outside to check for intruders inside the tower before entering and being caught off guard. Another defensive measure was the presence of wooden poles with cloth hanging from their tips, erected around the perimeter. These were well-known markers to those who used the outpost. They indicated the presence of pitfall traps directly beneath. While some might doubt the effectiveness of pitfalls, such simple traps were quite sufficient against undead of low intelligence. Because the living might fall in while fleeing in fear or confusion caused by the undead's abilities, no stakes were embedded at the bottom of these pits. Still, they proved effective for buying time when being chased or surrounded by the undead. Furthermore, neither flag is raised yet. Seems we have the whole place to ourselves. Though, there should be 2 other teams that entered the Katze plains besides us, and neither are using this as their base. Isn't it strange? Antwali and Bunaz observed the broken tower from a short distance not too far, due to the fog, as they exchanged words. The broken tower had a mechanism for hoisting flags installed inside, with 2 types of flags. One was to indicate that someone was using the tower, so they wouldn't be mistaken for undead. This was necessary because tragic incidents had occurred due to confusion, especially during nights with poor visibility or in extreme situations when being pursued by the undead. The other flag warned that there were powerful undead in the area, forcing those inside to barricade themselves in. The absence of either flag flying meant no one was present, which also meant there was a possibility of undefeated undead roaming the vicinity. In conclusion, it meant that they needed to exercise some caution when approaching the tower. Antwali raised his hand, signaling to those behind him. His companions soon walked up beside him. Candylon. Any undead reaction? Unfortunately, none. Candylon answered Antwali's question, and upon hearing, Anvario followed with a suggestion. Well then, should Uncle go take a look around with Fly? As usual, Antwali paused for a moment to consider. The broken tower stood at the center of a slightly elevated hill, and with the scattered debris that once made up the tower, enormous stones and such, there were many places hidden from view from their current position. For example, the far side of the hill. An aerial view would be quite different, however, even with the concealing fog. However, unlike Bunaz, Anvario's perception might not be enough to spot concealed enemies. Moreover, Antwali felt uneasy about letting Anvario, who was inferior in terms of direct combat ability, act alone in a place where they couldn't immediately come to his aid, even if only briefly. After all, some undead possessed the ability to fly. Antwali opened his mouth to speak when at Bunaz's voice, sharp with alertness, he closed it. Wait a moment. This was definitive proof that something serious had occurred. There was no way their team's eyes and ears would raise unnecessary alarm. The other members immediately assumed combat positions. Bunaz took a vial of medicine from his pocket and applied a few drops to his nose. He then sniffed the air like a dog. As I thought. There's no doubt. It's very faint, but there's a smell like blood. Antwali started to sniff the air himself, then stopped such a futile action. There was no way he could detect a scent that even a ranger of Bunaz's caliber needed an item to perceive. From where? I can't tell. It's so faint, it's like it's wafting from all around. Sorry. If you'll let me, I can scout ahead. No, leave it to Uncle instead. That's fine, right? Antwali nodded. The light dwelling in Anvario's staff faded. Summon monster third dot. A large, black-furred wolf appeared before Anvario. Unlike an ordinary wolf, however, its body harbored a faint fire, and flickering flames escaped its mouth with each breath. It gave off a faint smell of sulfur, causing Bunaz to hurriedly cover his nose. The wolf sniffed the air around them. So, where's this blood, or rather, this blood-like smell coming from? And can we be sure it's really blood? With a growl, the wolf turned its face toward the tower. My, oh my! Seems like it's blood after all. That's bad, ain't it? Looks like it's coming from the tower's direction. I see. Then have the wolf go ahead and find the source of the blood smell, if there's any physical evidence. If not, guide us to the location. Also, Candelon. Any undead reactions? Again, unfortunately, none. I'll go explain the situation to the others in the rear. Deets. As the summoned wolf ran toward the tower at Anvario's command, Candelon walked toward the porters with Deets, who had nodded silently in response. While splitting forces in this unclear situation might seem unwise, it was necessary. Antwali didn't object as he furrowed his brow and glared at the broken tower. Specifically, at the place where flags should have flown. When Candelon and Deets returned from the porter's position, the wolf-type monster had carried out Anvario's orders and returned as well. Since it hadn't taken much time and there had been no sounds of battle, it likely meant there were no undead near the tower. The wolf held something like a piece of cloth in its mouth. Anvario picked it up delicately and held it so Antwali and Bunaz could see it clearly. A blood-stained scrap of clothing, the make is imperial perhaps? Let me see it. Bunaz took the cloth and examined it closely. From the cut marks, this wasn't done by a blade. These are from claws or fangs. I think. There aren't any parallel marks, no, wait, maybe are there? If so, these would be from large fangs or claws. Large claw marks didn't necessarily mean it was a large undead. There were monsters with disproportionately large fangs or claws compared to their body size. However, since those were the exception, it was reasonable to assume this was the work of a large undead. Antwali recalled the information he had gathered before leaving the city about the teams that should have entered this area. While neither of the teams were particularly exceptional, they weren't weak enough to be easily wiped out either. They should have been able to handle the undead that typically appeared in this area without any problems. I've never heard of such a large undead appearing around this broken tower. So did they lead it here from somewhere else? It was conceivable that a team had ventured deep into the plains, been pursued by a powerful undead, and somehow managed to flee to this Fort Alice, where they lost consciousness and died. That's possible. Since Anvario's monster wasn't attacked, it's most likely already left the area, though it's just as likely that it's still around. Anvario. Could you tell if there were any corpses? Yep, sure seems that way, Anvario replied after observing the wolf's reaction, but I can't say how many. Didn't have it looked that carefully. We should go. Leaving the corpses unattended could lead to trouble. At minimum, we should give them the proper rights and dispose of them. Candelon's words were correct. If this was the work of an undead with the ability to raise kin, those who were killed might become undead if the proper measures were not taken. Additionally, there were cases of corpses becoming undead if left unattended, although this was usually extremely rare. More like something that might happen once in a great while. However, in this land, this rare occurrence wasn't quite so rare. And when this undead genesis occurred, it was said that the resulting undead had strength commensurate with the strength of the being that became its base. So what kind of undead might emerge from the corpse of someone who had the resolve and confidence to set foot in this dangerous land? Moreover, there was the possibility that such a person was carrying powerful equipment, in other words, magical items. No one would want to deal with such an enemy. If such an undead claimed an outpost like the first broken tower as its lair, it would be extremely troublesome. Hey, hey! If they drew an undead here, wouldn't that be troublesome? Unlike territorial beasts, I've never heard of undead deliberately returning to the deeper regions. Wouldn't it be wiser to leave as quickly as possible? We don't know which team was wiped out, but if we're talking about an undead that powerful, Bunaz's words were also true. Normally, they couldn't abandon the situation. Securing the safety of the broken tower would be paramount when considering future activities. However, there would be no future activities for Fist. If they were leaving Vadis after this job, clearing the broken tower would be risking danger for no benefit. And yet we don't have enough information to either secure a safe zone or retreat. Let's circle around the area first, then proceed to the tower. Right. Footprints, traces of battle. We need to look for these things. Dietz muttered softly. If they could find footprints, they might be able to identify the type of undead. If they found traces of battle, they might be able to learn the enemy's attack methods. Perhaps even its weaknesses. With such information at hand, the scales of battle could tip dramatically in their favor. At times, it could even be used to defeat an overwhelmingly superior opponent. That was how valuable such information was. Yes. Any objections? Antoine looked around at everyone. None? Then, let's go. After calling over the porters, the group began to circle around the hill, maintaining even greater vigilance than before. This time, Anvario walked alongside Antoine and Bunaz, with the summoned wolf guarding the center of the formation. Then, on the side opposite to the city they departed from, to the south the direction deeper into the Katze plains, they saw that part of the defensive wall had been destroyed inward. This confirms it. Multiple human-sized footprints with large, irregular strides coming from further south towards that spot. 3, 4 sets, maybe? These are definitely the signs of an escape. So the undead appeared, pursuing whoever left behind these footprints, assuming it couldn't enter without a gap that size. It must have been quite large. About 3 meters in width, perhaps? That would suggest an impossible height. While it was difficult to estimate the entire body from just the width, it was certainly not human-sized. No, wait. That's too hasty. Look, Bunaz pointed at the ground. No giant footprints, nothing that looks like it would belong to an undead. Unless it has some special ability like Forest Walker, it should have left some footprints on the ground, right? And there's no sign it burst up through the ground either. Which means they were being chased by a flying undead, and a battle took place here. If the undead was capable of flight, it made more sense to assume the wall was destroyed during some kind of battle rather than because it needed to break through to enter. The wood used in the wall wasn't particularly thick, so destroying it wouldn't have been difficult. Well, I can't tell for certain if a fight happened around there without getting closer to investigate. For example, there's also the possibility that a flying undead crashed into it at full speed and broke it. Ah, yes, that's certainly possible too. The breakage is a bit higher up rather than at the base. That's right. At this point, the only thing we can say for sure is that since it could physically destroy the wall to that extent, it's probably not incorporeal, right? What do you think, Anvario? Right. Uncle doesn't disagree. There could be some incorporeal undead that Uncle doesn't know about that can use magic, but if we start considering things like that, there'd be no end to it. But an undead that can fly and track targets accurately through this fog is bound to be trouble. So what do we do? Retreat here? Or press on to the broken tower? Uncle votes to press on. Yet. If it's an aerial opponent, we probably couldn't escape anyway, so we'd be better off either defeating it or at least identifying what we're dealing with. For now, straining my ears, I can't hear anything moving in this area besides us, but unlike living creatures, some undead can remain completely motionless. A retreating battle against a flying opponent was completely out of the question. In fact, flying enemies were generally difficult opponents. Especially those that could hover in the air or move up and down freely. Those would increase the difficulty of subjugation by at least 1 rank. Moreover, this was enemy territory. If they encountered other undead while retreating, things could quickly become extremely complicated. Agreed. I share the same opinion as those two. If it's a flying undead, that's all the more reason we need to clear the tower. Rather than being attacked in the open, I'd prefer to draw it into a fortified position, but before that, we should at least gather some information about what kind of undead we're dealing with. If there are any of our colleagues' corpses, we should examine them properly. No one objected to Antwali's decision, so the trio cautiously advanced toward the broken wall. Several of the wooden posts used as barriers were snapped in half, and it was doubtful they could provide the same defensive effective if reused. There were no traces of flesh at any of the broken points. Judging from the footprints, it didn't seem like a battle had taken place here. Climbing over the remains of the wall, the trio arrived at the broken tower's perimeter. Even from here, through the white fog, they could clearly see the unevenness of the rocks and thick bricks that made up the tower. The 5 companions followed closely behind Antwali's trio into the grounds, and the final 2 closed the distance to form up with them. Clustering together might be dangerous in an unsecured location, but it couldn't be helped since with flying undead potentially nearby, maintaining distance would be even more dangerous. They all understood the situation, so their faces were grim. Usually, they would smile upon reaching the broken tower, but the fact that such an oasis of safety had become a zone of danger might be what intensified their feelings of tension and unease. That's it. Following Bunaz's pointing finger, Antwali noticed several black masses on the ground. There were 3 of them. Candelon. Any undead reactions? None. Those are just pitiful corpses. Poor souls who met tragic deaths at the hands of the hateful undead in this land. We should perform a funeral service, even if it's just a simple one, before we secure the broken tower. Any objections? Antwali looked around at his companions. None, then. It was important to confirm the safety of the tower and establish a base. But during that time, there was no telling whether these pitiful corpses might reanimate as undead. Scouting the tower, or dealing with the corpses, which should they prioritize? In this situation with no clear danger apparent, setting priorities was extremely difficult, but splitting forces to handle both simultaneously would be the height of foolishness. In the end, they had no choice but to handle things one at a time. What they needed to do now was to eliminate the uncertainties before them, one by one. Candelon took the lead in offering prayers to the gods before the corpses. Beside him, Bunaz and Envario examined the bodies. Antwali and Dietz maintained watch over the surroundings, particularly wary of the sky. Though brief, the memorial rite is complete. Those who lost their lives to those accursed undead should now be able to rest in peace. All that is left is to bury them, so what do you say? That comes later. First, we will check if the tower's safe. Bunaz. Yet. Their injuries weren't caused by bladed weapons. Definitely monster-inflicted. Judging from the size of the footprints around them, I'd say it was a 4-legged beast type, at least 4 meters in size. And it has a long tail. Envario. I thought it was a Rottwyvern, but 4 legs? There's several types of undead spotted in these Katze plains that fit the bill, but considering this level of total devastation, what comes to mind is, a skeletal dragon maybe? But the size, was it 4 meters? Candelon, do you know anything of that size? I am not well versed enough in that area. Skeletal dragon? I heard one appeared in Irantal recently. Perhaps it fled here. No, Uncle heard that someone called Momon, an adamantite-ranked adventurer, defeated it. That's enough. Further discussion can wait until we've confirmed the safety of the broken tower. Stay alert. These were orders that could brook no argument. The group set out again, reaching the broken tower's main entrance. No undead appeared during their approach, but the tension remained unbroken. The entrance to the broken tower was a thick wooden door reinforced with iron studs, a testament to the efforts of those who had transported the materials from the free city of Vadis. The entrance was sized to feel slightly small even for humans, designed this way to impede large undead from entering. Bunaz nimbly approached the door and pressed his ear against it. No sounds inside. No signs of a forced entry either. Footprints leading inside are, unfortunately, absent. I'd say it's probably safe inside. Antwali moved to take Bunaz's place in front of the door and pushed it open. Candylon stood beside him. While they didn't doubt Bunaz's abilities, it was better to be doubly careful. Even undead perception that could pierce through the fog couldn't detect what lay beyond thick walls and similar barriers. However, once the door opened, that limitation would no longer apply. The door, kept well maintained as an important part of the base, opened without a creak. The interior was naturally pitch black, but Bunaz drew an alchemically created rhotic glow stick from his waist, bent it slightly, and tossed it inside. The solutions inside mixed together, illuminating the empty space with a white light. Darkness remained in some places, creating an eerie atmosphere as if the undead might be lurking in the shadows, but Antwali strode in boldly. And then, looks like there's no problem, Antwali declared. Most undead that hated the living would attack immediately, so if they weren't attacked upon entering, either nothing was there or it was a highly intelligent type. And the likelihood of the latter type of undead being in this area was extremely low. He turned his gaze to Candylon. Indeed. There are no reactions from those accursed undead inside. With Candelon's reassurance, Antwali called to the porters to come inside immediately. With no sign of the undead, it was better to have the inspector stay with the porters. Only the strong his comrades should remain outside, where it was dangerous. Now then, everyone. I think we should handle the burial first. Any objections? They had already performed a rite to appease the souls of the dead, preventing them from becoming undead, so in an ordinary place, they could have left the bodies as they were. Beasts and insects would take care of the remains. But in this land, there were no ordinary beasts. If left here, their bodies would rot and become a source of disease. No one wanted such things near the base. Using tools that were kept in the broken tower for such purposes, Antwali and his companions began digging holes. The task of digging fell to Antwali and Dietz, while Bunaz and Candylon kept watch over the surroundings. Anvario, who was out of stamina, searched the three bodies. While Anvario wouldn't be able to find mundane items hidden away in secret pockets, jewels and the like, he could detect items with enchantments, so in this case, he served as an adequate substitute for Bunaz. They weren't searching for mere gold and silver. There were three reasons for examining the bodies. First was to obtain useful items, particularly magical items. They might no longer be of use to the dead, but they could continue to benefit the living. Second was to avoid burying them with such items equipped, preventing the undead from potentially obtaining and being strengthened by them. It would be good practice to break apart metal armor and shatter weapons too, but there wasn't enough time for that. Still, they wouldn't take everything. It was natural to return personal effects to family or close friends if they existed, and they always left at least one piece of jewelry on the body when they buried it. This was partly because there were undead who came into being through attachment to stolen items. It was also partly due to the superstition that taking everything from those who fell during their journey would bring bad luck. The final reason was to check for anything like a diary that might record the actions they took since they entered the Katze plains. Around the time they finished digging the first hole, Antwali remembered their earlier conversation had been interrupted. Come to think of it, let's continue where we left off. We were at the part about the adamantite-tranked adventurer Momonga defeating it, right? Momonga. There couldn't be a worker or adventurer in the vicinity who didn't know that name. If there was, they must be an outcast, ostracized and isolated among their peers. Or perhaps they didn't understand the importance of collecting information. Whatever the reason, such people would likely lose their life soon, weeding themselves out. It followed that everyone left would know this name. A warrior who had risen to adamantite, the highest adventurer rank, at unprecedented speed, wielding two huge swords and clad in full plate armor as black as night, bearing the title of Dark Hero. In other words, the strongest warrior in the surrounding nations. At his side stood a woman of fearsome beauty acclaimed as the Beautiful Princess, and his mount was the famous magical beast known as the Wise King of the Forest, said to possess unparalleled strength and majesty. Though to be honest, Antwali felt no admiration for him as a fellow warrior. Their worlds were too different. Mammon was a great figure from another realm, someone who could only be gazed up at from afar. A true living legend, the very protagonist of the heroic tales sung by bards. While naive children might still dream, now that he understood the nature of the world all too well, he knew Mammon wasn't a good target for comparison. Antwali himself would never be a hero sung of in epic tales. One couldn't live always looking up at the sky, at least not for long. Yet, just the two of them mowed down a horde of undead that suddenly appeared in Irantal's huge cemetery, and even downed a skeletal dragon. I believe I said this to you all when I first heard the story, but I can only say it again. What a great man he is, Candylon said gravely. Purging the land of those abominable undead. Magnificent. If I ever meet him, I must treat him to a drink. Come to think of it, I do remember you once suddenly shouted a toast to Mammon. Antwali hadn't forgotten how Candylon had raised his cup with such vigor that the alcohol inside had splashed onto his own face, getting in his eyes and making him writhe in agony. Yes. Though he didn't say it out loud, he definitely hadn't forgotten. We are getting off track again. We are talking about the skeletal dragon, not Mammon, right? Are we certain about this? This uncle's judgment is pretty spot on. First of all, there's no discoloration of the skin, indicating they weren't wounded by poison. The cause of death wasn't from any special ability, but likely physical trauma. Judging from the parallel wounds, probably from claws? Followin' that line of thinkin', it really does point to a skeletal dragon. I couldn't find a warrior in their party, judging from the equipment of the deceased. They must have stayed behind as a shield where they first encountered it. Antwali, who also fought as a shield for his companions, offered a silent prayer. For the warrior who wasn't here. Dietz must have felt the same way. He muttered in a voice more subdued than usual. The warrior couldn't help their companions escape completely, but managed to get them this far. Hey! It's a shame we can't give their remains a proper burial. So what abilities does a skeletal dragon have? So far, I've heard they have no poison and can fly. Skeletal dragons have complete resistance to magic and, like most skeletons, complete resistance to piercing attacks. As I thought. I'm not great with blunt weapons, you know. This was to be expected from Bunaz, whose primary weapon was a bow. Of course, even if he called it a weakness, he could still use blunt weapons better than the average worker. But there was a big difference between a weapon one was skilled with and those one wasn't. This difference became especially evident in life-or-death battles against powerful enemies. Just focus on defense and act as a target. The rest of us will handle taking it down. Right, right. I'm a bit worried cause the size of the footprints seems bigger than records indicate, but Uncle's memory has been getting less and less reliable lately. In any case, if we all work together, it's not an unbeatable enemy. Well, Uncle would just be in the way. So I'd like to support with defensive magic before the battle starts, and then hide and watch. I don't want to cast spells like making the ground unstable since I'm not sure how well they'd work on a skeletal dragon. Might just end up getting in everyone's way. As always, I'll leave it to you, the expert, to decide how to best use magic. Though he had more knowledge than most would consider an amateur compared to Envario, Antwali was still an amateur. Such amateurs could only hinder the professionals by suggesting strange ideas. It was better to trust in what the professional does and leave everything to them. Envario was a companion worthy of that trust. Recalling clients who only got in the way by making foolish suggestions, Antwali strongly resolved not to become like them. As they were burying the first body and covering it with earth, Antwali caught sight of Bunaz raising his head from the corner of his eye. Quiet! At Bunaz's tense voice, Antwali and the others froze their movements. Even trying to avoid the slightest sound of armor scraping against itself. Something whooshing through the air. Over there! Along with those brief words, Bunaz pointed to the south. Acting on reflex rather than conscious thought, Antwali and Dietz drew their weapons, while Candelon activated a spell to detect the undead. Meanwhile, Anvario cast Reinforce Armor, strengthening first Antoile's and then Dietz's armor in turn. They might not be attacked, and if they weren't, it would be a waste of mana, but that was better than being 2 moves too late if they were attacked. There's no undead reaction. Candelon's mutter caused Antoile a moment of confusion. But it must still be too far away. As they stared into the white fog, they glimpsed another white form. A dragon made of bones appeared, falling more quickly than flying through the air. It was much closer than they had expected. Impossible. At this distance. No undead reaction. That's not an undead? That can't be. Dietz raised a confused voice at Candelon's repeated mutters. The figure composed entirely of bones was unmistakably undead to anyone's eyes. However, Candelon was also using detection magic. If that was the case, it could only be a golem-type monster. That would require a completely different strategy. No. That's definitely a skeletal dragon. It must have resisted the detection magic with its complete resistance. Everyone understood at Anvario's shout. So that was it. The skeletal dragon, over 4 meters in size, landed on the ground, causing the fog to momentarily clear before settling back. It languidly turned its long neck, so the composite bone skull atop it faced toward Antoile and the others. The hatred for the living that could be felt in those empty eye sockets was surely no illusion. Its landing presented an opportunity. They had to defeat it here, without letting it take to the sky again. Let's go. Antoile and Dietz would confront it head-on. Bunaz and Candelon would stand guard in front of Anvario. This formation was probably optimal for the situation. Antoile and Dietz split left and right to charge at the skeletal dragon. However, they didn't commit fully, ensuring they could retreat quickly if need be. This was because they did not yet have a full grasp of their enemy's combat capabilities. First, they needed to gauge the weight of its attacks. Then, its attack methods. And most importantly its reach. To understand the enemy's effective range of attack. That said, though this enemy was strong, they had no intention of losing. They had faced greater enemies before in terms of size. While the monster before them was certainly a large and formidable opponent, it didn't radiate the unique pressure that came with facing an opponent on a completely different level. The 2 frontliners slammed their respective weapons into the body of Bones. It was hard. But there was a feeling that they were inflicting serious damage. Antoile's lips curved into a faint smile, and though likely not in response, the skeletal dragon began its attack. Antoile caught sight of its massive jaws lunging at Dietz from the corner of his vision. Trusting in Dietz, he pushed that sight from his mind. There was no room for such luxury. It closed in on Antoile with its massive white claws. The bite attack targeted Dietz while the raking claws came for Antoile. This attack pattern was favorable for the defenders, since the probability of getting hit would be higher if all attacks were concentrated on a single person. However, the huge claws approaching from both sides were faster than he anticipated. Should he block the hit or dodge? Blocking would be easier than dodging, comparatively. However, if he blocked, he would need to properly redirect the enemy's force to create an opening for attack. Additionally, he only had 1 shield. While he might successfully block an attack from one side, he would need to parry the attack from the other side with his weapon. A weapon that was tiny when compared to the enemy's claws. So he dodged. Though his heavy armor slightly reduced his ability to evade, he had been focusing his stance and awareness on defense from the start. It wasn't an impossible maneuver to accomplish. He twisted his body to the side as something massive and white passed through his field of vision. Instantly, he ducked low. Without even a moment's pause, tremendous air pressure passed over his head. He gripped his weapon tightly in his right hand and stepped in. Darting into close range, he struck with his weapon. Though his stance was compromised from focusing on evasion and his full strength wasn't behind his attack, he could see cracks forming in the white bone. Of course, for a body this massive, it was a small wound, but certainly more than a scratch. He continued his attacks while maintaining this distance, staying inside the enemy's reach, but this wasn't a stationary exchange of blows. Instead, he moved as if trying to circle behind the enemy. Without needing words, he trusted that Dietz would read his intentions and move to the opposite side for a pincer attack. Perhaps understanding the danger of being surrounded, though it was unclear if this was possible with only a brainless skull, the skeletal dragon sank its body low while beating its massive bone wings. These wide wings of bone were as hard as iron, with tips as sharp as blades. To the warriors who had moved to both sides, the wing beats themselves became attacks. Moreover, this wasn't even primarily an offensive motion. While Antwali managed to land one strike while protecting his head despite the danger, he couldn't prevent the skeletal dragon from taking flight. Tch. He clicked his tongue. Fighting in 2 dimensions against an opponent that could move freely in 3 dimensions was quite troublesome. Especially when they couldn't prevent attacks on the rear guard. However, with Bunaz and Candilon there, it shouldn't prove fatal. Looking up to track the skeletal dragon, Antwali clicked his tongue again. The mental image he had formed was of the skeletal dragon taking to the sky. He had pictured himself, maintaining vigilance, straining his eyes to track the enemy's shadow cutting through the white fog, swinging his weapon as it swooped down to attack him before returning to the sky once more. However, it was different in reality. The skeletal dragon had merely risen into the air rather than truly taking flight. And now it was plummeting straight down. Its massive body was aiming for him. Hit and run tactics were troublesome, but being crushed would be disastrous. He could probably survive a single hit. However, being pinned down by its weight would leave him unable to escape and subject to one-sided attacks. That had to be avoided at all costs. Forgetting about attacking and positioning and everything else, Antwali desperately threw himself away from that spot. He hurled his entire body forward in a diving roll, then used that momentum to raise himself up. The ground shook behind him. Since he felt no pain, he must have successfully evaded it. When he hurriedly turned around, his view was suddenly blocked by a stone wall. He could see the skeletal dragon's head behind it. Anvario must have cast wall of stone to prevent Antwali from being pursued when he had completely exposed his back. Indeed, a stone wall extended from Anvario's position to where Antwali stood. The problem was that Dietz wasn't visible on Antwali's side of the wall. If Dietz was on the same side as the skeletal dragon, it was obvious he would be the focus of all its attacks. Should he run to circle around the stone wall, or destroy it? Anvario. Take it down. Wall-type spells could usually be dispelled at the caster's will. Wait. Antwali shot a quick glance at Bunaz. Even though the skeletal dragon was behind the wall, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. The wall of stone only reached 2 or 3 meters from the ground and was merely a temporary obstacle for an enemy that could fly. Even so, he turned to look at Bunaz because he sensed abnormal tension in that voice, and moreover, because an ominous intuition was spreading in his heart. While still watching the skeletal dragon ahead, Bunaz kept frequently casting glances at the sky. Seeing signs of the worst possible scenario approaching, Antwali clicked his tongue again. Then, upon realizing that Bunaz was restlessly scanning the surroundings, particularly the sky above, he had a premonition of the worst possible outcome, and clicked his tongue once more. Could they win? How many? Probably 2. Just as he thought. A total of 3. This was dire. The current situation was extremely bad. Antwali's face contorted. A skeletal dragon was a powerful undead that one would rarely encounter except in the deepest reaches where the undead extermination efforts weren't thoroughly carried out. For 3 such undead to be present was far too abnormal. What's going on here? Is this all because some fools ventured too far into the depths? Or is something else happening? In his mind, Antwali cursed at those 3 who must have drawn the skeletal dragons here. At the same time, he felt respect for their skill and luck in escaping this far. What should we do? What's the right move? The best option would be to flee into the tower. While the undead didn't tire, making an endurance battle disadvantageous in that sense, it was still better than fighting in the open. No, that might be their only chance of survival. He could sense Dietz battling the skeletal dragon on the other side of the wall of stone. It would be possible to retreat now, but that would be the same as abandoning Dietz. With his full plate armor, it would be a risky gamble to see whether Dietz could outrun a skeletal dragon. They needed someone or something to act as rear guard. Therefore, there was only one move. Summon Monster Third. His trusted companion cast the spell. Understanding the situation without needing words to be spoken, he had chosen the correct option. What was summoned was a large bear with faintly glowing fur. Just one. With a growl, it charged toward the skeletal dragon to take Dietz's place. At the same time, the wall of stone vanished like a mirage. Retreat! Get to the tower! He shouted at the top of his voice, and started to run. The shouting was less an instruction to his companions and more of a declaration to those inside the tower. He caught sight of two white shapes in the thin fog. They're fast. At this point, they couldn't afford to spare Bunaz and Candelon just to protect Anvario. With three enemies, Antwali, Bunaz, and Dietz would each need to face one. Whether for their side or the skeletal dragon's side, many against one would be overwhelmingly disadvantageous, and losing even one person would instantly tip the balance. Therefore, Anvario should position himself alone by the tower entrance, ready to escape inside at any moment. Bunaz should run around drawing the enemy's attention while providing support with potions and such. Candelon should maintain overall awareness and use healing magic as appropriate. That would be optimal. We'll regroup inside the tower. They could freely cast strengthening magic inside the tower to boost their combat abilities. As he shouted instructions and ran desperately, there came repeated heavy thuds, the sound of something massive landing on the earth. Two completely unharmed skeletal dragons had landed between Antwali and the tower. Not the worst-case situation, but quite bad nonetheless. The problem was that one of them had landed near the door. The skeletal dragons turned their heads toward them, glaring intimidatingly at Bunaz, Candelon, and Anvario who had nearly reached the door. The team had been split up. Antwali suppressed his rising sense of urgency while considering strategy. That said, fleeing to the city wasn't an option from this position. Their opponents were flying undead. The chance of successfully escaping were almost none. While they could try rushing past the two skeletal dragons to get into the tower, success was uncertain. The best option would be to reduce their numbers while the summoned bear kept one occupied. Earlier he had felt they were split up. But that wasn't it. It was they who had pincered the dragons. Just as Antwali opened his mouth to give instructions, having made up his mind Antwali. Once again, Bunaz's shout rang out. The overwhelming tension filling that voice made his earlier despair of facing three skeletal dragons seem mild in comparison. They're coming. 1. No 2. 2 more. Additional reinforcements. What nonsense was this? It was cheating. What's coming? More skeletal dragons? There's no way something this absurd could happen. Antwali was stunned. Skeletal dragons were not the kind of undead that just appeared in abundance. Or were there countless skeletal dragons roaming the depths of the Katze plains? If any more skeletal dragons appeared, it would be the end. All they could do was pray to the gods that these were different, weaker undead. Soon Antwali could hear the sounds too. From the direction of the city beyond the wall and fog came running sounds. Heavy but nimble footsteps, something completely different from the galloping of a horse's hooves. At least it didn't sound like skeletal dragons. That wasn't their only stroke of luck. The skeletal dragons also seemed distracted by the new intruders, halting their movements. Still, there was no doubt they would attack immediately if anyone made the slightest move. It was just a momentary stillness similar to the brief pauses that sometimes occurred during battle. He swallowed the saliva that had gathered in his mouth. A brief moment passed, and shadows broke through the fog to reveal their true form. Since it was beyond the defensive wall, he couldn't see clearly, but it was something too large to be human. The massive figure leaped, crashed into the wall, and then climbed up it vigorously. A magical beast? But what kind? While horses were the commonly used mounts in the neighboring countries, many special creatures existed too. For instance, there were giant lizards, and in some places people even rode large insects, giant ants or giant mantises. Particularly among adventurers, magical beasts like the eight-legged Shalltear were dream mounts. Among these, the most coveted were flying magical beasts like griffins, hippogriffs, and wyverns. So while what had emerged from the fog wasn't a flying magical beast, that didn't mean it was any less impressive. On the contrary, everyone present was captivated by the sight of the beast that revealed itself atop the wall even in the midst of battle. The fact that even the skeletal dragons, who shouldn't have been moved by beauty, had stopped moving was proof enough that whatever had appeared was a force to be reckoned with. That was how magnificent and dignified this magical beast was. Its beautiful fur was reminiscent of silver, and in this ghastly land it was like a breeze of fresh air. Its eyes held a deep wisdom, instantly suggesting it was one of the most highly intelligent magical beasts. After skillfully maneuvering its front and back legs to quickly scale the wall, it descended toward Antwali's group with fluid grace that could only be described as elegant. The magical beast began running again. Gazaru, Gazaru, Gazaru! A majestic war cry rang out. Its rider was completely clad in jet-black armor. A crimson mantle flowed from their shoulders. Their left hand confidently held the reins, while their right brandished an unsheathed greatsword. The skeletal dragons shifted to face the new arrivals, sizing them up. The warrior and magical beast raced past Antwali and the others, closing in on one of the skeletal dragons. Antwali expected the warrior to swing their giant sword. So he found the following scene perplexing. "Is it not time, my lord?" The magical beast seemed puzzled too, crying out in a panicked voice. Though they seemed to have entered striking distance, their feet didn't stop. It was almost like they were aiming for a body slam. "Look out!" The moment Bunaz shouted, the skeletal dragon moved. Its massive tail struck the warrior, sending their body flying through the air to slam into the ground and roll away. "Goza!" The magical beast let out a strange cry, as if it couldn't believe what just happened. After nimbly slipping past another skeletal dragon's attack, the magical beast rushed to the fallen warrior's side. "What was that?" Dietz, who had somehow ended up right beside Antwali, muttered involuntarily. The emotions and feelings contained in those words were ones Antwali shared. After suddenly appearing, rather than avoiding, blocking, or countering the skeletal dragon's attack, they had taken the hit and been sent flying. What an utterly incompetent display as a warrior! The stark contrast with their mount's magnificent appearance created such a large gap that it was confusing. Antwali hesitated on whether to approach the warrior who lay motionless on the ground. Taking a tail strike to the chest without defending with their sword was serious. The air would have been completely forced from their lungs, and they'd be lucky if that was all. If unlucky, their ribs might have broken and pierced into their internal organs. Given they weren't moving at all, the latter seemed more likely. If they were going to heal them, sooner would be better. However, while facing three skeletal dragons, could they afford to spare any effort on a warrior who might not even be able to help? Or should they have Candylon cast healing magic on them, hoping they could serve as a shield? The time spent hesitating was probably less than a few seconds. Just as Antwali was about to shout, proof emerged that his hesitation had been pointless. The warrior stood up with easy movements. There wasn't the slightest hint of pain in their motions. They seemed to feel no more discomfort than someone who had merely tripped and gotten back up. Even the skeletal dragons appeared confused by this strange situation, as they seemed to be watching the warrior more warily than Antwali's team. Considering it ended up without a single scratch, it must be an extraordinarily powerful set of magical armor. Strong enough to absorb all of the damage. Or perhaps they had activated some kind of martial art. This is difficult, the warrior grumbled while casually brushing the dirt from their armor and slowly beginning to walk. I see. So they didn't take the hit because they were incompetent. They took it because they knew this would happen. Because they had absolute confidence in their defense. Judging from what they muttered, they had clearly been aiming for something. Something that required taking the enemy's attack head-on. What that was, Ainz didn't know. However, that magical beast, that set of armor, enduring such a blow unscathed, they're clearly no ordinary warrior. That jet black armor. I see. So this is the rumored warrior. Hamsuk. I shall leave this one to you. Gain some experience. Understood, that it is. Hamsuk must be the magical beast's name. It swung its whip-like tail, keeping the skeletal dragon at bay. I will take care of the remaining two. You adventurers over there, you wouldn't mind if I cut in, would you? If you'd rather I didn't interfere, I can just stand back and watch. Can you take them? While maintaining his guard against the skeletal dragons, Ainz asked the warrior. It won't be a problem. The warrior made this quiet declaration and began walking. That stride conveyed an overwhelming sense of confidence, even more so than their words. The earlier hit had undoubtedly been intentional. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to show such dignity. No, that was to be expected. If the rumors were true. For that warrior, it would be only natural. The warrior's identity was an obvious answer. Ainz murmured to his gathered companions. That's an adventurer of the highest rank, adamantite. Mammon of darkness, he had heard that Mammon wielded twin great swords, but now he held only one. While understandable when he had been mounted on the magical beast, why hadn't he drawn the other now that he was on the ground? Perhaps for this battle he's prioritizing the weight of each strike over the number of attacks? The Dark Warrior replaced Ainz as the one facing the skeletal dragons. Hamsuk, who had been fending off the skeletal dragons, engaged one in battle, leaving the other free to lunge at Mammon. Mammon brushed away the blow from its right claws with his sword. The way he wielded such a large sword as easily as if it was a twig was proof that his strength far surpassed normal human limits. He swung with a speed that Ainz couldn't have evaded, deflecting the left claws as well. Then Mammon spun in a complete rotation and swung his sword. What? A spin move. Mammon's strike seemed to be aimed at the skeletal dragon's bony arm. Instead, it collided with the long tail of the skeletal dragon that had been sweeping through the thin fog toward Mammon as it twisted its body and forcefully knocked the tail flying back. Ainz could clearly see splinters of white bone scattering widely. The skeletal dragon's massive body lost its balance. What an incredible strike! No, more importantly, what was the point of spinning around like that? The enemy was right in front of him. Is he just showing off? No, surely not. Mammon was a warrior, and an adamantite-ranked adventurer. In other words, this meant he stood at the pinnacle of warriors. Someone of his caliber wouldn't make any wasted movements. Just like before when he seemingly took a hit carelessly, there must have been some hidden intent behind it. Ainz desperately racked his brain. An adamantite-ranked adventurer was demonstrating his combat prowess right before his eyes. It would be wasteful not to absorb every detail into his very being. Being overwhelmed by the aura of a strong man and just staring in awe while muttering Mammon-sama, would be the act of a spineless fool. He wasn't some princess from a knight's fairy tale. He wasn't such an effeminate weakling, or at least he wanted to believe he wasn't. That was why he forced his mind to work hard. But even so, damn. I can't understand it. I can't read his aim. The reason Ainz couldn't grasp Mammon's intentions was because he didn't stand on the same level as this supreme warrior. Other warriors at that same height could probably understand the reasons behind Mammon's actions. It was frustrating. Extremely frustrating. But still, that was no excuse to abandon his analysis and stop thinking. If he had any desire to aim higher as a fellow warrior, he should try to read even a little of his exemplars, Mammon's, intentions. As Ainz desperately tried to discern Mammon's intent, he caught Dietz's inadvertent mutter. A martial art, is it? Something clicked in Antoile's mind. However, he couldn't put it into clear words. It felt like a single piece had finally fit into a jigsaw puzzle that was still largely empty. But why did he need to do a full rotation? Bunaz's question was one that Antoile shared. However, the words martial art did make some sense. Among Antoile's knowledge, there were no martial arts that involved spinning like that. Of course, Antoile didn't know every martial art in existence. Therefore, it must be either a high-level martial art he wasn't familiar with, or one original to Momon. In other words, that earlier move was a martial art that called for demanded a full rotation. However, this raised another question. Why had he chosen to use such a martial art? He understood wanting to land an effective strike on the tail, but if he was going to use a martial art, there was no need to choose that one in particular. A strong strike or something similar would have sufficed. And his companion provided the answer. Probably a martial art for countering attacks from all directions. That's it. I see. Antoile couldn't help but raise his voice. All the pieces fell into place. He felt the joy of a difficult puzzle finally being completed. That earlier strike hadn't been deliberately aimed at the tail, rather, the tail was the only part it had managed to hit. I can reckon what Dietz is sayin', but Uncle has a question. Why choose an all-directional attack against a single opponent? If we consider his team composition, we can guess the answer, Antoile said. I suspect Momon only trained counter-type martial arts that attack in all directions. That's right. I hear Momon's team consists of only one other member, a magic caster called Nabe. This means he frequently finds himself surrounded by enemies as the only frontliner. In that case, learning martial arts that can attack multiple enemies at once would be his highest priority. Conversely, martial arts that only affect a single target would be low priority. Of course, he probably learned some, but still. Perhaps this was also why Momon chose twin greatswords as his main weapons. Martial arts that hit multiple targets simultaneously typically dealt less damage than single-target ones. So, he likely chose weapons with high destructive power to compensate for this reduced damage. Once one piece became clear, the overall picture of Momon's combat theory emerged. His equipment wasn't chosen out of mere vanity or simple preference for maximum firepower. He had selected the optimal solution for his circumstances. Truly a warrior of the highest caliber. You might expect a bit more carelessness or playfulness. No, that's wrong. This is exactly why he's adamantite rank. While admiring this thought, Antoile watched the battle unfold intently, trying not to miss a single one of Momon's movements. It was probably the bad habit of a warrior, but his thoughts involuntarily drifted to consider how he might land a hit on someone like this. The rational part of his mind understood. Don't consider Momon as a hypothetical enemy. It would be pointless to do so. Even just analyzing this brief battle made it clear he couldn't defeat Momon. Not one-on-one, and probably not even with his whole team. Antoile wasn't confident he could withstand those fearsome strikes. In their line of work, workers sometimes had to fight adventurers. Therefore, they should absolutely decline any requests that might put them up against Momon. And yet helplessly there might come a time when they had no choice but to fight him. Preparation for such a time was necessary. He could repay the debt of being saved some other time. These were not contradictory actions. Overwhelming him with numbers, surrounding him would be dangerous, given what we've seen. The best approach would be to frequently switch who faces him directly while fighting. Well, the best approach would be not fighting him at all. Antoile gave a wry smile at his own thoughts along these lines. Still. Before his eyes, the skeletal dragon took Momon's blow and reeled backward, scattering fragments of bone. That huge body, recoiling. It was an unbelievable demonstration of strength. That overwhelming physical capability was more reminiscent of a mighty monster than a human. Judging him critically, there might be some flaws in his offense and defense as a warrior. No, Mammon was the highest ranked warrior who undoubtedly chose the optimal solutions. There must be some rational explanation for what appeared to be gaps in his fighting style. Perhaps he was being cautious about revealing all his techniques to Antwali's team. Did he sense something in my gaze? I feel no hostility towards him, but I can't honestly say I don't feel any desire to challenge him. Is he sensing some potential for violence from that? Is that what it means to be the level of an adamantite-ranked adventurer? If Mammon was sensing such ill intent from him despite having just saved their lives, it would be terribly discourteous. At that moment, whether because the summoned bear had been defeated by the enemy or Envario had dismissed it, the first skeletal dragon was freed and began to move. Its target, perhaps deeming him the greatest threat, was Mammon. It charged forward, extending its neck to bite him into pieces. Normally, Antwali's party should have tried to prevent this. After all, they were the ones originally being attacked. However, they couldn't intervene. For two reasons. First was fear of getting in the way. Antwali and his companions had experienced it themselves, that feeling of wishing someone would just stay put rather than offering unwanted help. Though usually, that someone was a client. The difference between what Mammon, a warrior of the highest rank, could see and what Antwali's group could see was likely vast. What Antwali and the others might deem as being in a pinch probably wasn't even worth calling an inconvenience from Mammon's perspective. In that case, acting on their own assumption of danger might only interfere with Mammon's strategy. And the second reason was that they didn't even have time to act. It happened suddenly. Like a bolt of lightning, a beautiful woman descended from the sky and swung her long sword downward, capitalizing on her momentum. The sword, still in its sheath and effectively turned into a blunt weapon, struck the skeletal dragon's head. While that single strike would have ended the life of any normal monster, those slender arms couldn't crush the skull of a skeletal dragon. Even so, taking the full kinetic energy from above caused the skeletal dragon's head to slam into the ground below. In contrast, the woman who had dropped from above didn't become a smear on the ground, but instead hovered in the air. She had undoubtedly activated some kind of flight magic or similar ability. Someone muttered her name. So that's Nabe. It was to be expected that she would be here if Mammon was present. The high-tier magic caster, the beautiful Princess Nabe. Even from this distance, it was clear that her looks lived up to that title. He had never seen such beautiful features before. Of course, according to rumors, she was more than just that. She was someone who possessed considerable ability. Indeed, she was the sole companion of the adamantite-ranked adventurer Mammon. She couldn't possibly be mere window dressing. After all, here she was, a magic caster engaging in close combat with a skeletal dragon completely resistant to magic. If magic didn't work, she must be confident in achieving victory through other means. I see. She was staying back because she was wary of the other dragon. Or maybe he left unspoken the words, "She was wary of us." Even though I was ordered to stand by, I hope this was acceptable. Though Antwali probably hadn't heard her, the beautiful Princess Nabe asked Mammon. Yes, perfect timing. Forgive me. I shall end this one quickly, so please buy me some time. Then Mammon made a bold declaration toward their party. Playtime is over. This was not arrogance or an empty boast. It was born of absolute confidence and firm self-assurance. And then his presence changed. In an instant, his launching foot exploded, gouging the earth. His stepping foot shook the ground like an earthquake. Overwhelming speed. For a moment, Antwali couldn't understand what had happened. A crescent-shaped afterimage flashed through the air, and only when the skeletal dragon's head suddenly fell to the ground did he realize that Mammon had swung his sword. The sight left him speechless. Until now, perhaps partly because he had been watching from a distance, he had been able to track the greatsword's trajectory with his eyes. But this was different. It was as if Mammon had stepped into another realm entirely. The sword's speed was as though he had become a different person. And such sheer destructive force. Antwali stood silent. It was too overwhelming for words. Was this really the same warrior, the same human as before? How much talent, ability, experience, and magical items would it take to make such a feat possible? Despair welled up inside Antwali as he was suddenly confronted with this insurmountable gap in ability. Preparing to fight Mammon? Ridiculous. If they ever found themselves in such a situation, the first thing to do would be to beg for mercy. With dignified steps, Mammon walked toward Nabe. Despite his magic caster companion fighting with a sword in close combat, he showed no sign of hurry. That must be because he had complete trust in his partner. One strike. Antwali and the others heard his confident declaration. Nabe. Thanks for keeping this one busy. I'll take over from here. Yes, Mammon San. And soon it was proven that Mammon's declaration had been no lie. Information source text, Hittery additional editing, Fire Dragon 1X and P-Dragon 18 version, 1.0, 010525.